Hey guys, tonight we slip into the crooked, lantern-lit alleyways of a medieval town, the air thick with wood smoke and the faint tang of herbs drying from an upstairs window. You duck inside a narrow shop lined with dusty jars, cracked clay pots, and bundles of roots strung from the rafters. This is the apothecary, half doctor's office, half mysterious bazaar, and maybe just a touch of snake oil carnival. Shelves creak under the weight of powders, resins and dried leaves. Each claims to cure something: headaches, toothaches, plague sores. But some of these concoctions promise more than healing. They promise release, oblivion, or a shimmer of ecstasy. You probably won't survive the medieval medical system if you actually had to rely on it. But don't worry, tonight you get to browse without the bill. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is where you are. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You shuffle closer to the counter where the apothecary greets you with a knowing grin, already sizing you up as someone who might need a little extra. His table is spread with pestles, scales, and parchments scribbled with recipes. The medieval world doesn't separate medicine from drugs the way we do. To them, a remedy for insomnia might as well be a sleep-inducing narcotic, and a cure for melancholy might mean a dose that leaves you woozy and grinning. Historians still argue whether apothecaries knowingly pushed addictive substances, or if they simply believed in their cures too strongly to notice the side effects. Your hand hovers over a jar labelled opium poppy. In small doses, crushed seeds soothe pain and calm nerves. In larger doses, well, let's just say you're not waking up for choir practice. Nearby, a vial of powdered mandrake root waits, prized as both anesthesia and hallucinogen. Legends claim the root screams when pulled from the earth, killing the unfortunate digger. The apothecary insists that's just superstition, but he winks anyway, as if enjoying the thrill of keeping you half terrified. On another shelf sits a sticky block of resin, frankincense, mostly for churches, but here sold as medicine for chest ailments. Burn it, inhale it, and feel a subtle headiness creep in. Aromatherapy, medieval style. Some customers buy it for spiritual highs, others just for the sweet smoke to mask the smell of unwashed neighbours. You lean over to inspect a jar of dried henbane. The apothecary taps your hand away. Careful, he warns. A pinch dulls pain, but too much brings visions of demons. That one's not a tourist sample. Medieval physicians balanced on a razor's edge, where the same herb could be salvation or a slow, twitching death. And yet customers lined up, desperate for relief from toothaches, childbirth, or battlefield wounds. Imagine craving Advil and instead being handed a draft that might put you into a 3-day trance. Curiosity draws you to a container of dried toads, ground into powder for strength. You raise an eyebrow. The apothecary shrugs, saying, "Folk believe." Maybe that's his polite way of admitting it does nothing but thicken the stew. But sometimes the placebo was enough. In a world where hope was scarce, even a foul-tasting potion could feel like magic if it distracted you from misery for a while. The shop grows busier. A woman with a child on her hip asks for sleeping syrup. He measures out a sticky concoction of honey, poppy juice, and wine. The child sips, eyelids drooping within minutes. You cringe, imagining giving a toddler something one step shy of morphine. But in medieval logic, anything that kept the baby quiet so the mother could spin wool was a miracle. You overhear a knight clanking in, demanding a potion for courage. The apothecary offers a mix of spiced wine and a drop of opium tincture, a liquid pep talk. Whether it works because of chemistry or because the night believes it will, the effect is the same. You smirk. Modern energy drinks aren't so different, just with better branding. Among the drawers you find crushed juniper berries, sage and rosemary, herbs still familiar in kitchens today. Back then, they weren't just for seasoning, they were medicine, disinfectant and occasionally mood shifters. A sprig of rosemary under the pillow might banish evil dreams. Did it work? Who knows? But at least your pillow smelled less like mildew. The apothecary leans close and whispers about a rare import, hashish. Traders from the East bring small lumps of the pressed resin. Expensive, exotic, and whispered about in taverns, it's said to unlock laughter and visions. In this little shop it's kept hidden, available only to those who ask in hushed tones. Not every town saw it, but the idea drifted across Europe on the same wind that carried silk and spices. The line between doctor, dealer and magician blurs before your eyes. You can almost feel the heady mixture of smoke, spice and damp parchment pressing against your temples. To step into this apothecary is to realize that medieval people lived in a constant fog of experiment, sometimes healing, sometimes harming, and often leaving them pleasantly dazed in between. The jars promise much, but no one guarantees the morning after, and so, as you step back into the cool night, you carry the sense of crushed herbs in your hair, the hint of mystery clinging to your clothes. Behind you, the apothecary's door creaks shut. The jars remain, waiting for the next traveller to gamble on the fine line between medicine and indulgence. You drift along cobblestone streets until the warm glow of a tavern lantern lures you inside. The air is heavy with chatter, lute strings, and the smell of roasted meat. But tonight you aren't here for dinner. You're here for what's in the mugs. Wine, the medieval staple, and not just wine as you'd expect it. No, here, every cup is a bit of an experiment. The tavern keeper pours a deep red liquid into your goblet, but before it reaches your lips he sprinkles in a pinch of dried rosemary, swirls in some honey, and even drops a shaving of cinnamon, imported at outrageous expense from far-off lands. Wine is rarely just wine. It's a liquid canvas for herbs, roots and spices. People believed these additions balanced the body's humours. You take a sip, and it tastes oddly like mulled Christmas punch, though with a sharper edge. The warmth spreading down your throat is both soothing and slightly dizzying. Here's the quirky part. Some vintners went further, infusing wine with downright bizarre substances. Powdered pearls for nobility, because why not drink jewellery? Crushed emeralds in tiny amounts, thought to cure poison. Or, if you're less lucky, a hint of lead from the cup, which sweetens the flavour but quietly shortens your lifespan. Historians still argue whether people understood the dangers of lead, or if they just liked their drinks smoother and didn't ask too many questions. You look around the room and notice different groups enjoying their own house recipes. Merchants sip spiced claret mixed with cloves, meant to warm the stomach and sharpen wit. Pilgrims nurse watered-down table wine steeped with wormwood, a bitter herb said to drive out melancholy, but in higher doses pushes toward hallucination. The line between therapy and party fuel is laughably thin. Your bench creaks as a monk slides beside you. He raises his cup filled with hippocras, a sweet spiced wine flavoured with ginger, galangal and sugar if he's lucky enough to afford it. Monks often brewed their own versions, arguing they were medicinal, though it's hard to ignore that faint rosy flush in his cheeks. He chuckles, telling you with a wink that St. Hildegard of Bingen recommended wine as a vessel for healing herbs. You nod politely, thinking, "Sure, father," but you also seem to be enjoying it a little too much. Nearby, a group of labourers guzzle something cloudier. Cheap country wine steeped with whatever was at hand. Garlic, fennel, maybe even dandelion roots. It's rough, pungent, but it keeps the aches away after long days swinging hammers or ploughing fields. In a world where pain relief options are limited, sometimes buzzed is good enough. The tavern keeper offers you another curiosity. Wine mixed with opium syrup known as diacodium, a medieval version of a sleep aid. A few drops would send you floating toward dreamland. A cupful might carry you straight to the grave. But customers lined up, swearing by its effectiveness. You sip cautiously, half expecting to slump forward into your stew. Luckily, he's watered it down. Tourist-friendly dosage. At the far end of the room, a troubadour strums his lute, singing a bawdy song about a knight who mistook a love potion for a wineskin and spent the night declaring his undying devotion to a goat. People roar with laughter, slamming their cups in approval. Humour and intoxication always dance together, no matter the century. Someone passes around a pitcher of wormwood wine again, and this time you catch the bitter tang as it burns your tongue. Wormwood would later become infamous in absinthe centuries down the road, but here it's just another way to balance humours. Do you feel your black bile lessening? Hard to say, but you do feel your legs a little unsteady as you stand. Wine wasn't only for taverns. Doctors prescribed it liberally. Suffer from melancholy? Try claret steeped with rose petals. Stomach upset? Add mint. Trouble sleeping? Warm it and drop in a splash of poppy juice. And if you had the coin, the recipes became ever more elaborate. One noble court served wine tinted with saffron, not just for its golden hue, but also because it was thought to cheer the heart. Your wallet might empty, but at least you'd smile while broke. The strange part is how normal all this felt to medieval people. They weren't doing drugs in our sense. They were drinking health tonics, chasing balance in a world that never quite made sense. And yet, watching a burly blacksmith stagger to the door, singing off-key about St. George and his dragon, you can't help but laugh. Some things look a lot like happy hour. Before you leave, the tavern keeper insists you try one last concoction. Wine mulled with nutmeg, ginger, and a hint of ambergris. Yes, that's whale intestine product, prized as an aphrodisiac. You take a hesitant sip, bracing yourself. The flavour is surprisingly pleasant, spicy sweet with a touch of ocean musk. Does it stir desire? Well, let's just say you'd rather not test it in public. As you step back into the chilly night, the tavern's laughter fading behind you, your head buzzes with the mix of herbs, spices, and a touch of opium's haze. Wine has shown you its double face, medicine in one sip, mischief in the next. You steady yourself on the wall and move forward, half grinning, half wondering if you should have stuck with plain water. Then again, medieval water could kill you faster than the wine. Maybe you made the right call. The morning light breaks across the rooftops, and you find yourself following the smell of malt and smoke drifting from a row of wooden buildings. It draws you like a magnet, straight toward the heart of daily medieval life, the brewery. You join townsfolk already gathering with empty jugs, ready to fill them for breakfast. Yes, breakfast. Imagine starting your day not with orange juice or coffee, but with a foamy mug of ale. That's exactly how it went for everyone, from farmers to children. The truth is, in this world, water isn't safe. Wells are shallow, rivers are clogged with waste, and parasites love to set up shop in every stagnant puddle. But fermentation? That's the lifesaver. The boiling, brewing, and alcohol content kill off most of what would otherwise have you doubled over in the latrine. So when you raise a mug of ale in the morning, you're not being indulgent. You're surviving. Of course, the little buzz that comes with it is a happy bonus. You take your first gulp. The drink is cloudy and warm, like porridge that decided to loosen its belt and relax. It's thicker than modern beer, sometimes so dense it counts as food. Small ale, with very low alcohol, is for children and servants. Stronger brews fuel labourers and soldiers. And in noble halls you'd find spiced, more refined versions poured into silver goblets. Every class drinks it, though the recipes differ wildly depending on wealth and available ingredients. Your attention drifts to the brewers at work, stirring vats with long wooden paddles. Before hops became widespread, they flavoured their ale with something called groot, a herbal mixture that could be surprisingly potent. You sniff one batch and catch yarrow's sharp tang, bog myrtle's resinous aroma, and the woodsy bite of wild rosemary. These herbs don't just make the drink taste better, they change the way you feel. Yarrow can tip you into euphoria. Bog myrtle sometimes sharpens dreams, and wild rosemary might clear your head, or, if overdone, leave you spinning. Historians still argue whether brewers intentionally dosed their customers, or if they just enjoyed tinkering with whatever grew nearby. At one corner a brewer sprinkles henbane seeds into his vat. Your eyebrows shoot up. Henbane is no joke. It's a plant associated with visions, delirium, and sometimes terrifying hallucinations. In tiny doses it calms and relaxes. In larger ones it conjures phantom animals and wild flights of imagination. No wonder some medieval councils tried banning it from beer, fearing both the side effects and the rumours of witchcraft swirling around it. But as you watch the brewer hum to himself, casually stirring the pot, you realise regulation didn't stand much chance against thirst and tradition. And speaking of witches, here's a quirky tidbit. Alewives, female brewers who sold their product at market, often wore tall, pointed hats so customers could spot them in a crowd. They set brooms outside their doors as a sign that fresh ale was ready. Over time, those images, hats, brooms, cauldrons bubbling with strange herbs, fed directly into later stereotypes of witches. You smile at the irony. The neighbourhood witch may have been nothing more sinister than the best brewer on the block. You sit at a bench where a group of townsfolk share their mugs. One man proudly explains that ale is food in his household. His children drink small ale with porridge, his wife kneads bread with it, and he himself downs stronger mugs before heading to the fields. Without coffee or tea in Europe yet, ale fills every gap. Hydration, energy, calories, even social glue. Imagine a world where every sandwich you ate came with a splash of beer. That's daily life here. In the distance, sailors load barrels of hopped beer onto a ship. Hops, still spreading across Europe, add bitterness and preserve the brew for longer journeys. Traditionalists grumble that it tastes too sharp compared to the old herbal ales, but sailors and merchants praise its endurance. Without hops, long voyages risk sour, spoiled ale. With them you can drink steadily while crossing the seas. It's easy to picture a sailor swaying on deck, comforted by his barrel, even if the horizon is pitching wildly. Back inside, a minstrel strums a lute and sings a cheeky verse about a bishop who condemned ale as sinful, only to sneak back for a mug when no one was looking. The room erupts with laughter. Everyone knows the truth. Ale is survival. If the clergy scolds from the pulpit, so be it. Tomorrow morning even the priest will likely sip a cup before prayers. The brewer offers you something stronger, a cocktail of sorts, mixing ale with wormwood for extra bitterness. You sip, and a shiver runs down your spine. Wormwood will one day become notorious in absinthe, but for now it's just another way to tinker with mood. Supposedly it sharpens the mind and chases away dark thoughts. Maybe it does. Or maybe you're just lightheaded from drinking alcohol before lunch. Either way, you laugh quietly, thinking, medieval happy hour starts at sunrise. Leaning against a barrel, you let the warmth of the ale spread through you. The line between sustenance and intoxication is blurry here, and everyone walks it daily. Children, labourers, monks, and nobles alike all rely on the same bubbling cauldrons. Some drink to survive, some to forget, and others just to enjoy the slow, dreamy haze it brings. As you step back into the sunlight, the street seems a little softer, the colours richer. Maybe it's the herbs, maybe it's the alcohol, or maybe it's just the way medieval life blends survival with indulgence. Either way, you realise you've had more than a taste of history. You've swallowed the daily rhythm of a world that lived half in hunger, half in a pleasant fog of fermented grain. Your boots scuff the dirt as you leave the bustle of the market behind, following a winding track that leads into the countryside. The chatter of merchants fades until all you hear is the rustle of stalks swaying in the breeze. Then you notice them. Pale green pods clustered on tall stems, crowned with soft red petals that shimmer in the sunlight. Poppies. They seem delicate, almost too pretty for the heavy role they play in medieval life. You crouch and touch one of the pods. A sticky, milky fluid clings to your fingertip. That liquid, the latex of the opium poppy, is the reason these fields mattered so much. Pressed and dried, it becomes opium, a substance that whispers promises of sleep, relief, and sometimes oblivion. In the Middle Ages, people used every part of this plant. The seeds were innocent enough, sprinkled on breads or pressed into oil. But the pods, those were powerful, dangerous, and irresistible. A farmer nearby explains how his family sells the seeds openly, but reserves the pods for trusted customers. He shows you a little pouch of dried sap, dark and crumbly. Just a crumb can dull toothache, soothe a fever, or quiet a restless child. Too much, though, and the child never wakes. He says this with the calm tone of someone who's seen both outcomes. You shiver. Physicians held the poppy in high esteem. They blended its resin into complex recipes like theriac, the most famous cure-all of the age. Theriac could contain 60 or more ingredients: cinnamon, ginger, honey, myrrh, even bits of dried snake. Mixed into all of that was opium, the heart of its strength. Doctors prescribed it for everything from snake bites to melancholy. Some versions aged for years, stored like fine wine, and grew more potent with time. Historians still argue whether patients truly benefited or if belief carried more weight than chemistry. You watch a village woman prepare diacodium, a syrup made by boiling poppy heads in water and mixing the extract with honey. She spoons it into her baby's mouth, murmuring thanks that the child will sleep through the night. The sweetness masks the bitterness, but the power remains. Today we'd call it unthinkably risky, but for her it's relief from endless crying and exhaustion. You want to warn her, but you're only a visitor, a ghost passing through centuries. In the marketplace, an apothecary offers a more indulgent creation: opium wine. He stirs dried resin into a jug of red, promising it will cure toothaches and ease sorrow. You taste a sip, thick, warming, with a strange, dreamy afterglow. The noise of the market dulls. Colours grow softer, and you feel oddly detached, as though you've stepped half a foot outside of reality. Is this medicine? Recreation? In medieval life there was no clear line. One man buys it for his aching joints, another for the loss of his wife. Both walk away comforted, though for very different reasons. The battlefield offered another stage for the poppy. Chroniclers describe soldiers drinking strong draughts before combat, dulling pain and fear alike. Some charged with reckless courage, feeling invincible. Others sank into stupors so heavy they barely held their swords. Surgeons relied on poppy potions to steady trembling patients before amputations or cauterizations. In some accounts, mixtures of wine, opium and mandrake acted like anesthesia, drawing victims into deep slumber. Modern scholars debate whether these concoctions worked consistently or if survivors exaggerated. But the fact they even tried speaks volumes about their desperation to escape pain. You pass a monastery garden where rows of poppies stand neatly cultivated. A monk explains their use for holy sleep. He insists the plant is part of God's creation, meant to help mankind. Yet he lowers his voice to confess his worries, that too much poppy leads to sloth, that visions during heavy sleep might be demonic illusions rather than divine messages. Still, when arthritis gnaws at his knees, he knows exactly which bed of flowers to visit. Another tale reaches your ears, half legend, half cautionary fable. A wealthy noble once demanded theriac every day to prevent illness. He lived in a constant haze, cheerful but detached, until one morning he never woke. Was it overdose, natural death, or simply a storyteller's way of warning against excess? Historians still argue, and perhaps we'll never know. But you can imagine the noble drifting through life, cushioned in dreams, barely touching the real world. You wander back into the poppy field, the blossoms nodding like sleepy heads in the wind. Their beauty feels deceptive, almost mocking. It's strange to think such fragile flowers held such sway over life and death. Medieval people didn't view them as we might, as drugs to be controlled and regulated. To them, these were gifts of nature, potent, risky, but sacred. If you prayed before plucking and dosed carefully, the poppy might carry you safely through fever or surgery. If not, well, it carried you somewhere else entirely. You imagine lying in the field, the scent of the blossoms filling your lungs, your eyelids heavy. The hum of bees fades into the hush of your own heartbeat. It would be so easy to surrender, to drift into that opium dream where suffering dissolves and nothing can touch you. But you stand instead, brushing the sticky residue from your fingers, and continue on. The road ahead winds toward other roots and herbs, each with their own secrets. Yet none will glow in your memory quite like the poppy, seductive, merciful and merciless all at once. You wander farther along the track, and soon the air grows cooler beneath a canopy of twisted branches. The grove feels alive, as if every root is a coiled animal waiting to spring. The soil here is rich and dark, exhaling a damp breath that clings to your clothes. Villagers crouch in small clusters, their spades scraping against earth as they dig carefully around a particularly thick root. Their faces shine with sweat, but their movements are cautious, reverent almost, as if they are unearthing treasure. The treasure is no ordinary plant. It is mandrake, a root that has haunted medieval imagination for centuries. To your eyes, fresh from the 21st century, it just looks like a pale tuber shaped vaguely like a pair of legs. But the people around you gasp as if they are holding something uncanny, something neither plant nor human. The root often splits into forked shapes that resemble tiny bodies, arms jutting, limbs twisted. The resemblance is close enough to spark unease. It looks like a doll buried alive. One farmer leans toward you, whispering with the solemnity of a priest. If you pull it wrong, the mandrake screams. That scream can kill a man where he stands. You blink, unsure whether to laugh or shiver. Plants don't scream, of course, or do they? Modern science does show that plants emit ultrasonic clicks when stressed, though nothing you could hear with bare ears. But in the medieval worldview, imagination carried heavier weight than biology. People devised elaborate precautions. They tied starving dogs to mandrake stalks, then tossed scraps of meat beyond reach. As the dog lunged, the root tore free, supposedly absorbing the deadly cry while the animal perished. Did villagers really sacrifice their hounds this way? Or was it just a story whispered to children? Historians still argue whether these rituals were ever performed, or whether they existed purely as cautionary folklore. Once wrestled from the ground, the mandrake root was dried, boiled, or steeped into thick, bitter brews. Physicians in cramped, smoky infirmaries prescribed it as a sedative, believing it calmed nerves, eased melancholy, and helped sleepless souls drift into dreams. Imagine lying on a rough pallet, clutching your belly from kidney stones or toothache, when the healer presses a cup to your lips. The taste is sharp, earthy, and nauseating. Your vision blurs, and then, if the dose is right, you slip into a fog where pain feels distant, blurred around the edges. But the line between relief and death was thin. Too much mandrake, and the patient did not wake again. Surgeons especially relied on it. Without anesthesia, amputations and cauterizations were screams and fire. A strong draught of mandrake wine might dull awareness enough for the blade to do its work. Did it truly help? Some chroniclers say yes, describing artificial sleep that lasted through surgery. Others dismiss it as wishful thinking, insisting that most patients still howled, half dreaming, half burning. Again, historians still debate whether mandrake genuinely produced narcotic sleep, or whether medieval observers exaggerated its powers. Beyond the sick room, mandrake slipped into the realm of magic. Housewives tucked small roots under pillows, whispering that the plant encouraged fertility. Imagine a woman clasping the shriveled body-like root against her chest, hoping its uncanny form might quicken her womb. Farmers buried pieces of mandrake at field edges to bless their harvest, while wandering magicians sold them as charms against evil spirits. Some even carved little faces onto the roots, turning them into grotesque dolls believed to bring luck or wealth. You picture a peasant returning from market, proudly holding one of these mandrake dolls. He sets it by the hearth, treating it as both mascot and talisman. His neighbours scoff, but secretly they wonder, what if it works? The line between skepticism and belief is blurry. After all, in a world where natural disasters seemed like divine punishment, who could afford to dismiss any chance at protection? Not all uses were innocent. Tales tell of thieves who sipped mandrake potion before night raids, stumbling into reckless bravado. Nobles whispered of rivals poisoned at banquets, their cups spiked with root-infused wine that left them babbling, incoherent, humiliated before lords and ladies. Whether these accounts record truth or exaggeration, the aura of danger surrounded mandrake like a constant fog. Monks, custodians of knowledge, wrestled with contradictions. In cloister gardens they tended rows of useful herbs, sage, mint, valerian, and often a hidden patch of mandrake. Some friars condemned it as devil's bait, but others admitted it relieved the abbot's migraines or eased a nun's insomnia. Picture a robed figure grinding the root into syrup, murmuring prayers even as he fears the act courts sorcery. That tension between medicine and magic defines much of medieval life. Practicality wrapped in superstition, skepticism battling with faith. At bustling fairs, tricksters thrived. They sold counterfeit mandrake, Ordinary parsnips carved into human shapes, dyed red with wine, hawked to gullible buyers at outrageous prices. The scam was so common that even reputable herbals warned readers, beware false mandrake. Still, people bought, clutching their roots with reverence. Maybe it was placebo, maybe it was faith, but for those who carried them, the mandrake's reputation was real enough. Night gathers in the grove, a fire crackles and villagers draw close telling stories. A bard sings of nights drugged by witches, lulled into enchanted sleep by mandrake brews. His ballad lingers on the eeriness of slumber that feels eternal, a dream that might never yield to waking. You lean back, letting the tune wash over you, imagining countless medieval souls who place their hope or their fear in this uncanny plant. As you rise, the villagers bury leftover scraps of root back into the earth. To them, it is a gesture of respect, returning power to the soil. You glance at the twisted silhouette one last time, its limbs curled like a tiny human. For a second, you almost expect it to twitch. The medieval world makes no effort to untangle myth from medicine. The mandrake remains both cure and curse, charm and poison. You tuck this lesson away, stepping back onto the winding path with a new respect for how blurred the line between healing and haunting once was. You step out from the grove of mandrake roots, the damp soil still clinging to your boots. Ahead, the path widens into a clearing where fragrant smoke drifts on the air. A cluster of women kneel beside woven baskets, their fingers stained crimson from berries. The smell is both sweet and sharp, an aroma that prickles your nose and stirs your curiosity. You're entering the world of henbane, another of the medieval era's most feared and revered plants. Henbane does not greet you like a friendly herb. Its leaves are thick, sticky and unpleasant to the touch, coated with tiny hairs that irritate skin. The flowers, though striking, look unsettling, bell-shaped blooms streaked with purple veins, as if bruised by something malignant. The women mutter charms while plucking the blossoms, careful not to brush their eyes or lips afterward. You sense immediately that this is no simple harvest. It feels closer to ritual. One elderly woman, her back bent like an old bow, holds up a sprig for you to see. "This one whispers to the dead," she says, her voice wavering. You want to ask what she means, but she continues before you can. "It eases pain, yes. It lulls the mind, yes. But take too much, and you walk with spirits." Henbane's reputation in medieval medicine was precarious. On the one hand, healers praised it for its ability to dull agony. Crushed leaves mixed into wine might soothe an aching tooth or calm the spasms of a cramp. Physicians sometimes added it to poultices, pressing the foul-smelling paste against swollen joints or inflamed skin. Imagine a sufferer of gout, his toes burning with pain, sighing in relief as the poultice numbs the throbbing fire. To him, the stink mattered less than the respite. But on the other hand, henbane's effects often slipped from remedy into nightmare. A dose too strong brought confusion, hallucinations, and a terrifying loss of self. Patients raved, shouted at unseen figures, or wandered half-naked through village streets, convinced they were flying or turning into animals. These visions were not entirely invention. Henbane contains tropane alkaloids, compounds that disturb perception and induce delirium. Modern pharmacology confirms what medieval people already suspected. The plant is both medicine and madness. No wonder, then, that henbane found a place in sorcery. Witches, at least in popular imagination, ground it with fat and ash to make flying ointments. They smeared the unguent on their skin, claiming it lifted them from Earth and carried them through the night sky. Scholars debate whether anyone literally believed they flew, or whether the drugged hallucinations created the illusion of flight. Yet the association stuck so strongly that henbane became inseparable from witchcraft tales. You picture a candlelit chamber, smoke curling against low rafters. A woman kneels over a cauldron, stirring henbane with belladonna and hemlock, whispering names into the darkness. Her face glistens with sweat, her pupils wide. Around her, others begin to sway, their minds slipping into strange landscapes of dream and dread. Perhaps they truly believe they soar above forests, rushing with the wind. Perhaps they wake sprawled on dirt floors, bewildered, unsure whether the journey was real. For the church, such plants carried the stench of diabolism. Priests thundered from pulpits that henbane was the devil's garden, planted to ensnare the faithful. To be found with it was enough to raise suspicion. Yet the contradiction remained. Monasteries sometimes cultivated it secretly, because despite its dangers, it could numb surgical pain or quiet convulsions. You imagine a monk, candle stub flickering by his desk, sketching the jagged leaf in a manuscript. His margin notes warn of death, yet also instruct the reader how to steep a safe draught. This ambivalence is the essence of medieval medicine, necessity battling with fear. Outside the monastery walls, the plant slipped into folklore. Farmers hung sprigs of dried henbane above barns, believing it warded storms and kept cattle safe. Travellers tucked seeds into their purses to protect against robbers. But the same plant was also blamed when madness erupted in a household. A youth babbles incoherently. He has eaten henbane by mistake. A girl shrieks in the night, clawing at unseen demons. She has been cursed with henbane smoke. Every misfortune seemed to find its scapegoat in the herb's sinister shadow. At fairs, hawkers exploited this fascination. They sold powders said to guarantee prophetic dreams. Pay a coin, sprinkle the powder under your pillow, and by dawn you would glimpse your future spouse or your fate in battle. Some powders were merely ground herbs, harmless except for the wasted coin. Others truly contained henbane seeds. Those who tried them often did dream, wild, chaotic visions stitched from fear and desire. But the dreams left them sweating and trembling, unsure whether they had touched heaven or hell. As twilight deepens in the clearing, a young woman begins to chant softly, sprinkling henbane seeds into the fire. The smoke rises in twisting coils, acrid and heavy. Villagers press their palms together, murmuring prayers. Some believe the smoke wards off wandering spirits. Others simply endure it, their eyes watering because custom demands participation. You feel your own head swim slightly as the fumes brush your face. The moment is both communal and disorienting, a reminder that medicine, magic, and ritual often blurred into a single experience. You think of the countless patients who must have placed their lives in henbane's hands. A soldier with a shattered arm, trembling before amputation, sipping a cup laced with the herb. A mother, frantic for sleep after days of fever, clutching at the bitter draught a healer presses into her palm. Did they drift into healing slumber, or did they tumble into terror and never return? The line was impossibly thin, and no physician could predict which side a patient would land on. As the fire sputters low, the women gather their baskets, now nearly full. They move with careful precision, as if each leaf carried both salvation and peril. You take one last look at the purple-veined flowers glowing faintly in the firelight. They are beautiful, yes, but in the way of storms or wild animals, beauty inseparable from danger. In medieval eyes, henbane was not merely a plant, It was a threshold, a key to realms of pain, ecstasy, madness, and perhaps otherworldly journeys. You turn back to the road with a heavier step. If mandrake was the root that screamed, henbane is the leaf that lies. It promises ease but delivers illusions, promising to heal yet dragging minds into haunted landscapes. To walk past it untouched is to survive another lesson in how medieval life balanced constantly on the edge of wonder and dread. The road winds upward into rougher terrain, and soon the air grows thin with the smell of resin and pine. Yet mixed with the fresh mountain scent comes another aroma, sharp, almost metallic like the bite of raw onion. You're entering the realm of hellebore, the plant medieval physicians both revered and dreaded. At first glance, hellebore deceives you. Its blossoms, pale green or ivory tinged with purple, resemble delicate ornaments. They bend gracefully above the soil, each flower like a small chalice. Yet beneath that beauty lurks poison. The roots, thick and gnarled, hold compounds capable of purging the body with terrifying violence. A shepherd, noticing your interest, warns you in a low voice. Hellebore cleans a man too well. He drinks, and the body empties. If the dose is wrong, he empties his life. His words are simple but chilling. You understand that in the Middle Ages, purging was thought to restore health, flushing out black bile or evil humours. Hellebore, then, was valued as a brutal but effective cleanser. Physicians often prescribed it when lesser remedies failed. A noble plagued by melancholy might be given hellebore in hopes of driving away his sorrow. Madness itself was said to retreat before it, as if the violent purge expelled not only sickness, but also demons. Imagine the scene, a darkened chamber where a nobleman raves, striking at unseen foes. The physician approaches with a bitter draught, coaxing him to swallow. Hours later the room reeks, the patient lies trembling, emptied of all strength. Perhaps his madness has lifted, perhaps it has not. But the belief remained. Hellebore had the power to cleanse the very soul. Hellebore also carried darker associations. Ancient tales claim that during the siege of Kira in Greece, enemies poisoned the city's water supply with hellebore, leaving the inhabitants too sick to fight. Medieval chroniclers repeated this story, half in awe, half in horror. To them, the plant was both weapon and remedy, a reminder that nature's gifts could be twisted into instruments of war. In village folklore, hellebore took on magical roles. Sprinkled across doorways, it was believed to repel evil spirits. Some carried dried roots as charms against curses. Yet paradoxically, the same plant was also linked to witchcraft. Accusers claimed witches fed hellebore to animals to spoil milk, or brewed it into potions that drove victims mad. Whether true or not, the mere presence of the herb in a cottage garden could invite suspicion. You pass a small hut where a healer is at work. On her table lies a basket of hellebore roots freshly dug. She slices them into thin strips, spreading them to dry. Her hands move with calm certainty, though her eyes flick to the doorway often, wary of intruders. You sense the weight of her knowledge. Too little of the plant heals nothing, too much can kill. The balance is razor thin, and every cut of the knife matters. In manuscripts, monks sketched hellebore with painstaking care. Marginal notes warned of its dangers, but also detailed precise preparations, how to steep it in vinegar, how to combine it with honey to mask its bitterness, how to measure a dose against the size of a patient's hand. These instructions reveal a world not ignorant, but cautious, aware that healing demanded risk. Medicine for them was not about certainty, but about courage, trust, and sometimes desperation. Picture a battlefield tent, winter wind rattling the canvas. A soldier groans with infection, fever burning his skin. The surgeon mixes a draught laced with hellebore, whispering a prayer as he presses it to cracked lips. Will it cool the fever or hasten death? In that moment no one can know. Such was the gamble of medieval healing. The plant's symbolic power extended beyond medicine. Poets wrote of hellebore as a cure for folly, a plant that restored reason to fools. Satirists mocked their rivals by suggesting they chew hellebore roots. Even kings were not spared. One chronicler hinted that a monarch's rash decisions might be healed if only he swallowed enough of the bitter herb. Behind the jest lay a serious truth. People believed hellebore touched not just the body but the mind itself. As dusk falls, villagers gather around a small fire. They toss dried hellebore leaves into the flames, watching the smoke curl upward. Some believe the smoke purifies the air, driving away sickness. Others mutter that the fumes invite spirits of the dead. You feel the tension between reverence and fear, as if the plant is always balanced between two worlds. One old man approaches you, his eyes cloudy with age. In my youth, he says, I took hellebore for madness. I saw visions, rivers of fire, birds that spoke. I thought myself lost. But when the fever passed, my mind was calm again. Was it the plant, or was it God's mercy? I cannot say, but I lived. His story lingers with you long after he turns away, a testament to the blurred line between cure and catastrophe. Walking on, you reflect on how medieval life was shaped by such gambles. Hellebore embodies that paradox, beautiful yet deadly, revered yet feared, used to heal the very ailments it might cause. To handle it was to wrestle with the limits of knowledge, to risk everything for a chance at health. It was not superstition alone, nor science alone, but a weaving of both, a reminder that survival often meant embracing uncertainty. The wind rises as you leave the mountain slope behind. The last hellebore flowers nod in the twilight, their pale faces ghostly in the fading light. You carry with you the knowledge that every step deeper into this world of medieval medicine is a step into ambiguity, where remedies bleed into poisons and hope is never free from fear. The road now dips into a valley where the air feels damp and heavy, almost like walking into the exhaled breath of the earth itself. Here, clustered beneath the trees, you notice a peculiar flower. Bell-shaped, dusky purple, its petals drooping as if weighed down by secrets. This is belladonna, sometimes called deadly nightshade, the plant that straddled the thin line between healing potion and witch's brew. You crouch beside it, and at once the plant seems to resist your gaze. Its berries, round and glossy black, shine like drops of ink against the green leaves. They look tempting, almost edible, but every tale warns against even touching them. A handful of these berries can silence a human heart forever, and yet, paradoxically, people once valued them enough to risk their lives for their effects. A travelling apothecary greets you on the path. His leather satchel rattles with small glass vials, and when he opens it, you catch the faint scent of dried herbs mingled with oil. He explains in a low, conspiratorial tone that belladonna was used to ease pain. Physicians would extract tiny amounts of the plant's juice, diluting it until the poison became, just barely, medicine. Applied carefully, it soothed muscle spasms and dulled the agony of wounds. Too much, however, and the patient slipped into delirium, their pupils dilating until the eyes looked like black pools, unfocused and frightening. That detail, the dilation of the pupils, is where the plant's name belladonna, meaning beautiful lady, originates. In Renaissance Italy, Women supposedly dropped belladonna juice into their eyes to enlarge their pupils, creating a look considered alluring and mysterious. You picture the scene: a noble woman leaning toward her polished mirror, a maid carefully squeezing the liquid onto her lashes. Beauty achieved, but at what cost? The dizziness, the blurred vision, the risk of permanent damage, all tolerated in pursuit of a fashionable gaze. You can't help but mutter a modern aside. Imagine explaining to your optometrist that you poisoned yourself just to look hot at the banquet. Belladonna's story deepens as night falls. Around the fire, villagers whisper of witches grinding its leaves into flying ointments. These ointments, smeared on skin, supposedly cause sensations of soaring through the night sky. Whether it was real flight or just hallucination induced by alkaloids, no one can say. Historians still argue whether such witch flights were purely the product of imagination, or whether ointments mixed with belladonna genuinely altered perceptions so dramatically that users believed they had left the ground. Either way, the association stuck. In the minds of fearful townsfolk, the plant became a witch's ally. But witches were not the only ones linked with belladonna. Assassins too found its properties useful. Tales circulate of feasts where goblets of wine were spiked with its essence, leaving rivals weak or lifeless. Was this truth or merely rumour spun to add drama to already bloody politics? The chronicles are murky, yet the possibility adds a shiver to your journey. To live in the Middle Ages meant never knowing whether the next sip might carry both flavour and fatality. Despite its fearsome reputation, physicians and monks continued to study belladonna. In monastic herbals, illustrations depict the plant in careful detail. Pointed leaves, nodding flowers, berries glistening like jewels. Marginal notes describe dosages with maddening imprecision. A grain for sleep, a draught for pain. Such vague instructions highlight the uncertainty of the time. Imagine being a patient, your body already racked with fever, watching the physician sprinkle powdered belladonna into your drink, hoping his grain was closer to a pinch than a handful. You wander deeper into the valley and find a healer's hut, smoke curling from its chimney. Inside, a woman stirs a small pot, the scent rich and earthy. She demonstrates how she prepares belladonna with fat, creating a salve for aching joints. Her voice is calm, practiced, but her hands tremble slightly as she stirs, betraying the respect, even fear that accompanies every use of this plant. She confides that she keeps her supply hidden under the floorboards, lest neighbours accuse her of witchcraft. You feel the tension that defined so many medieval lives, the constant balance between helpful knowledge and dangerous suspicion. Even beyond Europe, belladonna had cousins and parallels. Other nightshade family plants like mandrake and henbane shared similar reputations, part medicine, part magic. People grouped them together in stories, often imagining they were ingredients in the same sinister brew. You realise that to a medieval mind, plants were not merely biological specimens, but characters in a living drama. Belladonna was not just a flower, it was an actor playing multiple roles: healer, poisoner, lover, witch. One story drifts to you from an old soldier sitting by the fire. He claims that in battle, a wounded comrade once received a belladonna infusion to ease his pain. The man fell into such a deep sleep that his companions thought him dead and nearly buried him alive. Only hours later did he stir, dazed but breathing. Was the tale exaggerated? Perhaps, but the possibility reminds you just how close the plant danced with both relief and ruin. Your path now winds upward again, the valley fading behind. You glance back at the darkening fields where belladonna blooms. In the twilight, the flowers appear almost ghostly, their bells nodding as if acknowledging your passing. You carry with you a mix of wonder and unease. Wonder at how medieval people managed to coax healing from so treacherous a plant, and unease at how thin the line was between cure and curse. It strikes you that belladonna embodies the central paradox of medieval medicine: the willingness to risk death in order to ease life, the courage to experiment when certainty was impossible. For them, living meant constant negotiation with danger, and even the most beautiful flower might harbour both salvation and doom. As you step out of the valley and back onto the road, the stars begin to prick the sky above. You breathe deeply, grateful that you did not pluck the berries, grateful that you remain only an observer in this perilous garden of history. Ahead lies more of the same, remedies that are poisons, comforts that bring peril, and you wonder, half amused, half unsettled, in centuries to come, will people look back at your own pills and potions with the same mix of awe and horror? The next bend in the road leads you to the bustle of a market town, where stalls are draped with silks, spices, and unfamiliar bundles of dried leaves. The air carries the sharp scent of resin and the sweet smoke of incense. Here, among merchants with sun-browned faces and accents shaped by travel, you hear tales of a resin that brings laughter, calm, and visions, hashish. Unlike the hidden belladonna of dark valleys, this plant travels openly along the veins of the world's trade routes. From the Middle East to North Africa and into parts of Europe, cannabis resin was carried in sacks, pressed into cakes, and traded like any other valuable good. Some buyers sought medicine, others recreation, and some perhaps a touch of the mystical. A bearded merchant from Cairo invites you to his stall. He speaks of majoun, a sweet confection blending honey, nuts, spices, and powdered hashish. It is eaten slowly, savoured, and then, after a time, the world softens, colours grow brighter, laughter flows more easily, and worries slip away like leaves downstream. He chuckles, calling it the poor man's paradise. You picture medieval diners chewing the sticky treat, not knowing whether the sweetness or the substance inside caused their grins. Yet not everyone viewed hashish with amusement. Religious authorities often condemned it as a distraction from piety. In parts of the Islamic world, rulers banned it repeatedly, though it always returned, carried by travellers or secretly cultivated in fields. You imagine guards storming a gathering, confiscating the resin cakes, and burning them in the square while onlookers secretly mourned their loss. But human desire is hard to silence, and the trade endured. In Europe, the story's more fragmented. Medieval medical texts mention hemp primarily for rope, cloth, and seed oil. Yet travellers' tales whispered of its other powers. Crusaders returning from the Levant may have carried not only scars and relics, but also memories of strange herbs smoked or chewed. Chroniclers describe herb of laughter or herb of dreams, hinting at cannabis, though the details blur. Was it curiosity? Was it condemnation? The records rarely clarify. Sitting at a tavern bench, you overhear sailors arguing about it. One claims he saw men in Alexandria smoking little pipes and then lying on cushions, their bodies slack with contentment. Another swears that hashish turns men violent, recounting second-hand rumours of the mysterious hashashin, the assassin said to consume it before daring missions. You realise how legends attach themselves to plants, blending fact and fear until truth is almost impossible to extract. The word assassin itself, scholars debate, may link to hashish. Some say members of a secret sect used the drug to steal their nerves or induce visions of paradise before carrying out deadly tasks. Others argue the connection was an insult invented by enemies, a smear to make the sect seem barbaric. Either way, the word endures, carrying hashish forever within its syllables, whether the link was real or slanderous. Back at the market, a monk examines a resin lump curiously. He fingers his rosary with the other hand, torn between interest and suspicion. He mutters that some say the substance eases pain and quiets the mind, but he worries it could cloud prayer. He asks the merchant if it can treat insomnia, and the man nods eagerly, listing ailments hashish might relieve: headaches, fevers, melancholy. To the monk, it sounds almost useful. If only it did not carry such scandalous stories. You pause to imagine the medieval body in pain, the ceaseless aches of farm labour, the wounds of war, the fevers of plague. For people who had so few reliable medicines, the possibility of relief must have been tempting, even if it came wrapped in danger. Perhaps that is why hashish found its way into whispered conversations among healers and curious nobles. As dusk deepens, you follow a trail of smoke into a shaded courtyard. There, a small group reclines on carpets, passing a clay pipe from hand to hand. The smoke curls upward, fragrant and earthy. A man inhales deeply, then exhales with a satisfied sigh, eyes closing as if in prayer. Another laughs suddenly, as though struck by an invisible joke. The mood is peaceful, unhurried, almost ceremonial. No one speaks of poison or death here, only relaxation and fleeting joy. But outside the courtyard, the town crier calls out proclamations, punishments for theft, warnings against sorcery, and pointedly against foreign intoxicants. Fear of disorder, fear of loss of control, fear of foreign influence, all these conspire to make substances like hashish suspect. You sense how societies constantly balance between embracing and condemning such plants, never fully deciding. You return to the road with mixed impressions. Hashish is both exotic sweetmeat and forbidden vice, medicine and menace, bridge between cultures and wall between beliefs. It travelled thousands of miles to reach these markets, carried in saddlebags, hidden in barrels, slipped across borders. Each lump of resin bore not just the scent of cannabis, but also the fingerprints of smugglers, traders, priests, rulers, and ordinary folk searching for comfort. For you, the traveller, hashish reveals a truth of the medieval world. It was never sealed off, never isolated. Goods, ideas, and intoxicants flowed ceaselessly, carried on camel caravans, merchant ships, and whispered tales. A plant born in one land could end up reshaping habits half a continent away, and whether accepted or condemned, its presence left a mark, on language, on medicine, on legend. As the night closes around the market town, you find yourself wondering, how many medieval people drifted into gentle laughter because of hashish? How many found courage, or delusion, or solace? How many stories that now seem purely myth were born in rooms hazy with its smoke? Perhaps you will never know, but the faint scent of resin lingers in your imagination, a reminder that the history of drugs is not just about plants, it is about people, endlessly curious, endlessly willing to experiment with the unknown. You leave the smoky courtyards of the town and wander toward the countryside again, following the sound of chanting. A wooden cross rises above a small monastery, its stone walls damp with moss, its garden neat with rows of herbs. This is a different kind of encounter with substances, not the bustling trade of hashish, but the quiet ritual of wine and herbs within religious practice. Inside, monks sit with folded hands, their voices weaving plain song that rolls like gentle waves through the cloister. On a side table, chalices gleam in candlelight. You notice the rich red liquid they contain, not just ordinary grape juice, but fermented wine, an everyday drink in much of medieval Europe and a sacred symbol in Christian ritual. In the Eucharist, wine becomes the blood of Christ, consumed reverently. You picture lips touching the rim of a shared chalice, the sweetness or sourness of the vintage mixing with the seriousness of prayer. Wine was far more than a holy symbol. It was practical, safer than water, often fortified with herbs or honey. Travellers carried it in flasks, peasants brewed rough versions from local grapes or berries, and monasteries cultivated vineyards with scientific care. You imagine the daily rhythm of monks, sunrise prayers, labour in the fields, study in scriptoria, and a measured ration of wine to sustain their bodies and spirits. A medieval health manual even recommended wine as a digestive aid, though cautioned that too much could lead to what we would politely call singing off key in the refectory. The sacred and the social overlapped constantly. A nobleman might drink wine at Mass in the morning, then again at a banquet that night, each sip carrying a different weight. Wine was medicine, sacrament, and entertainment all at once. You realise how unusual it is that a single substance could hold such varied roles without contradiction. Yet alongside wine were the herbs of the cloister garden. Monks were some of the most knowledgeable keepers of plant lore, and they infused their knowledge into the cup. Mulled wines with spices, cloves, cinnamon, and nutmeg imported at staggering expense were prescribed against chills and fevers. Wormwood might be steeped into a bitter tonic for stomach ailments, while mint soothed the chest. Imagine a medieval monk handing you a goblet of warm spiced drink and assuring you it would balance your humours, even as you secretly hoped it would just make the long winter night more tolerable. But not everyone agreed on wine's holiness. Some reformers worried that the drink encouraged vice more than virtue. Historians still argue whether heavy drinking was more common among monks than laymen, or whether chroniclers exaggerated scandals to make lazy abbots look bad. You might picture a stern bishop wagging a finger at brothers who poured too generously, while the brothers quietly argued that a cheerful spirit serves God better. Beyond Christianity, other faith traditions of the medieval world also wove substances into ritual. In Jewish practice, wine sanctified the Sabbath meal. In Islamic cultures, where wine was prohibited by religious law, scholars debated whether fermented drinks with different bases, like date wine or fruit cordials, should be treated the same. Travellers' accounts suggest some communities observed the letter of the law strictly, while others found loopholes, raising cups quietly in private gatherings. The contrast is striking. In one town, wine was holy, in another, forbidden. And yet humans everywhere seem to crave ritual drinks. The sensory world of these rituals mattered. Picture the warm glow of candlelight flickering against carved stone walls, the smell of beeswax mixing with incense, the deep taste of wine on your tongue, carrying notes of earth and fruit. Imagine how powerfully that combination, sight, scent, sound, taste, would imprint itself on memory. Even if you didn't believe in the miracle, you would feel something shift in you. The monks also experimented with stronger brews. By the later Middle Ages, knowledge of distillation spread, and some religious orders began crafting potent liquors. These spirits, early versions of what would later become brandy or herbal liqueurs, were called aqua vitae, the water of life. Served sparingly, they were meant to heal, to invigorate, to preserve. But surely some monk, after a long night of copying text by candlelight, discovered that Water of life could also make psalms sound just a bit more cheerful. You pause under the cloister archway, realizing that for many medieval people, the line between drug, food, and sacrament blurred constantly. Wine could be sacred blood, common refreshment, or dangerous temptation. Herbs could be medicine or magical charm. Even water, if blessed, became something other than ordinary. This fluidity feels alien to modern categories, where we separate medicine from recreation, religion from pharmacology. In the scriptorium, a younger monk copies a Latin text onto parchment. The words describe how different herbs affect body and soul. He dips his quill, muttering about sage for memory, rosemary for grief, and, of course, wine for courage. He pauses, smiles slightly, and adds in the margin a doodle of a man holding an oversized goblet. You realise that even in the solemn world of monasteries, humour found its way onto the page. Stepping back outside, you notice villagers arriving with baskets. They've brought grapes for pressing, honey for mead, herbs for tinctures. The monastery serves as a hub, blending sacred ritual with community life. Everyone, it seems, has a relationship with these substances, whether through prayer, healing, or celebration. You picture how many lives were shaped by the quiet exchange of plants and drinks in places like this. You walk away, reflecting on how religion shaped not just beliefs, but also consumption. A simple sip of wine could mean eternal salvation, social bonding, or a slip into excess. Herbs in the garden could mean healing, flavour, or superstition. And though rules tried to govern use, people always found ways to bend them, because what mattered most was not just the rule, but the human need for comfort, ritual, and connection. As the chants fade behind you and the night grows cool, you realise that medieval substances weren't just about altering the mind. They were about anchoring the soul. Whether at the altar, the feast table, or the bedside, these drinks and herbs helped people navigate a world full of uncertainty and hardship. They carried meaning as much as chemistry, and that perhaps is their greatest intoxication of all. You wander farther along the winding road, past stone cottages and overgrown hedges, until a pungent scent drifts toward you, musky, earthy, unmistakably sharp. Someone nearby is tending hemp fields. Tonight, you arrive at the world of cannabis, hemp, and the blurred boundaries of use in the medieval imagination. Tall, spindly stalks wave in the breeze, their fibrous stems destined to become rope, cloth, or parchment-strengthening fibres. Hemp was a workhorse of medieval agriculture, valued more for utility than intoxication. You picture villagers stripping stalks for fibres, their hands raw and sticky, muttering complaints that the smell never washes out. Every fishing net, every ship's rigging relied on hemp rope. Without it, trade across seas would have tangled and snapped before it began. But then there were the leaves and flowering tops, less openly displayed. In certain regions, those parts were brewed into teas or smoked in primitive pipes. Accounts are fragmentary, but they whisper of cannabis as a medicine for pain, seizures, or melancholy. You imagine an apothecary sneaking a jar of dried hemp leaves from beneath the counter, grinding them into powder, and advising, "For your aching joints, boil this with honey." The patient might not know whether the warmth in their limbs came from sugar, herb, or faith, but relief was relief. Historians still argue whether recreational cannabis use was widespread in medieval Europe, or confined mainly to contact with Middle Eastern cultures through crusade and trade. Some evidence suggests hemp was common only as a material, while the psychoactive use belonged largely to Arab, Persian and Indian traditions. You can almost picture a medieval scholar returning from Baghdad, babbling enthusiastically about hashish cafes, while his colleagues blink and ask, "So, you mean hemp can do more than make rope?" In Islamic lands, hashish flourished even while wine was condemned. Poets praised it, mystics hinted at spiritual insights found within its haze. You picture a Sufi circle in Cairo, men swaying gently, whispering verses that twine like smoke around them. To them, cannabis was less about laughter and more about dissolving the ego, reaching toward divine union. Of course, not everyone approved. Rulers issued bans, clerics thundered sermons, and local authorities raided hashish gardens. Yet somehow the plant kept spreading, resilient as weeds tend to be. In Europe, the trail is subtler. A medical text from the 9th century lists hemp as useful against flatulence, though you might snicker at whether the cure was worse than the complaint. By the 12th century, herbalists noted its ability to dull pain during surgery, mixed with wine and vinegar. Imagine lying on a rough table, gripping the edge as a barber surgeon sharpened his knife, while an assistant handed you a bitter brew of hemp and herbs. You'd gulp it down, praying it would knock you into enough stupor to miss the worst part. Not exactly modern anesthesia, but you'd take anything over the alternative. Yet stigma grew alongside use. Some medieval Christian writers lumped cannabis with magical plants, claiming it clouded judgment and tempted demons. One monk described it as a tool of idlers and tricksters, though whether he personally sampled it is conveniently unrecorded. Here's where you catch a faint joke. You can almost hear the brother scolding, "That plant makes you lazy," while his listeners nod off halfway through his sermon. Cannabis even brushed against folklore. In parts of Eastern Europe, hemp seeds were cast into bonfires during midsummer festivals, their crackle interpreted as signs of good harvests or fertility. The smoke curled upward, mingling with laughter, dancing, and just maybe a lightheadedness not entirely due to heat. For villagers, the line between ritual and recreation blurred seamlessly, and nobody kept footnotes explaining whether it was sacred or just fun. Meanwhile, hemp's fibres tied it to military power. Castles, ships, and armies all depended on rope and cloth spun from hemp. Without it, sails would tear, siege engines would collapse, and armies would march barefoot. You sense the irony. A plant that soothed pain and inspired mystics also enabled wars and conquests. Humans, it seems, never let a good resource stay in one box. Scholars today debate how much of the psychoactive use filtered into medieval Europe, since evidence is scattered like dried leaves. Was it a hidden indulgence of apothecaries, a practice of wandering healers, or simply too ordinary to merit chronicling? Perhaps the silence in the records is its own clue. Hemp was everywhere, yet not remarkable enough for most writers to dwell on. Imagine yourself trying it, medieval style. A healer hands you a crude pipe carved from bone packed with dried hemp. You inhale, coughing as acrid smoke bites your throat. Minutes later, your body loosens, your worries about taxes and fevers dimming. Outside, the village drums thump. People dance around bonfires, and for a fleeting moment, life feels not just survivable but sweet. Of course, the same plant still clothes you. Tomorrow you'll wear hemp tunics to work the fields, you'll sleep on hemp-stuffed mattresses, and you'll lash hemp ropes around barrels for transport. That duality, utility by day, escape by night, echoes through the medieval relationship with cannabis. You glance back at the hemp fields, noticing their rough beauty in the moonlight. The stalks stand like soldiers, yet their leaves curl like open palms. This plant anchored entire economies, bridged continents, comforted the sick, and scandalized the pious. All from one green stalk, rooted in soil and tangled in human desire. And so, walking onward, You realise cannabis in medieval times was less a secret drug craze and more a tapestry of meanings. Rope for the ship, cloth for the body, medicine for the pain, incense for the ritual, and whispers of smoke for those daring enough to try. In its many forms, it connected people to the practical and the mystical, to survival and transcendence. As the wind shifts, carrying the scent behind you, you feel how easily one plant could shape the lives of millions, quietly and persistently, as much a part of medieval life as bread, wine, or prayer. The road curls along riverbanks, and soon you reach a market where merchants shout over the din of donkeys, chickens, and clinking coins. But your nose twitches. Beneath the smell of dried fish and cheese is something sharper, resinous, almost spicy. You've stumbled into the world of resins and exotic imports. Myrrh, frankincense, opium, and the fragrant bundles hauled from distant deserts and mountains. These weren't just perfumed luxuries. They were quite literally the medieval pharmacy's gold dust. Picture the scene. Traders from Arabia, Persia, and India spread their wares across wooden stalls. Lumps of amber resin glisten like hardened honey. Tiny clay jars hold powdered opium, tucked discreetly behind more respectable bundles of cinnamon and cloves. Wealthy customers hover, pursing their lips, weighing whether to spend precious silver on something they can't eat but can inhale, burn, or dissolve into a tonic. Frankincense and myrrh, famous since biblical times, were burned in churches across Europe. You imagine the heavy smoke curling through cathedral arches, cloaking saint statues, and clinging to your hair until you smelled like holiness itself. But outside the church, those resins were ground into potions to calm coughs, soothe swollen gums, or even mask the smell of wounds. Medieval healers swore by myrrh for digestive troubles. You picture a sick villager grimacing as he chews a bitter glob, praying relief comes before the taste drives him mad. Then there's opium. Imported along trade routes from the east, it shimmered with mystery. A pinch dissolved in wine could send pain floating away, or lull a fevered patient into rest. Surgeons treasured it, mothers sometimes feared it, and rulers taxed it. You lean closer and imagine the apothecary spooning out a crumb, muttering, "Not too much, unless you want him sleeping through Christmas." Historians still argue whether opium was common in daily medieval Europe, or largely reserved for elites and scholars. Some records suggest it was rare, controlled, and outrageously expensive, while others hint that travelling peddlers carried poppy resin for village healers. The truth likely shifts by region. An herbalist in southern Italy, with closer ties to Arab traders, might have had better access than a healer in rural England. The silence in many records leaves you squinting at gaps, like trying to read a manuscript that mice have chewed. And then the quirky part. Some medieval texts lumped frankincense and opium into the same category of sleeping powders. Imagine dozing in a medieval inn where the air is thick with frankincense smoke, only to realise the owner slipped opium into the nightcaps. That would explain why you feel halfway between sainthood and stupor. Resins also doubled as status symbols. Burning them wasn't just about the scent, it was about announcing, "I can afford spices brought halfway across the world." A candle might be humble, but frankincense was a flex. Picture the lord of a manor waving his hand dramatically as servants scatter resin on hot coals, ensuring every guest knows just how global his wealth smells. But these imports weren't always treated with reverence. Some church officials fretted that exotic scents distracted worshippers, turning prayer into a kind of sensory indulgence. You can hear the sermon now. Frankincense lifts prayers heavenward, but beware, too much, and you forget to pray at all. That's medieval moderation for you. just enough incense to tickle the angels, not enough to choke them. Even more fascinating is how these imports mingled with folk magic. In certain villages, myrrh was burned not for health, but to ward off demons or bad luck. You imagine a grandmother scattering resin onto embers, muttering charms in a dialect even priests barely understood. Was it medicine, ritual, protection? Probably all three, and nobody thought it strange to blur the lines. A travelling story from the late Middle Ages even describes pilgrims carrying frankincense sachets as a kind of medieval air freshener against plague miasmas. Picture yourself trudging through crowded streets, clutching a pouch to your nose, convinced the sweet smoke will keep death itself at bay. Science might disagree, but in the middle of a pandemic you'd cling to any hope that smells nicer than rotting garbage. And don't forget amber resin, the fossilised sap that sometimes trapped insects. Medievals believed powdered amber had healing power. You can almost hear the sales pitch. Drink this and you'll live longer. Did it work? Probably not. But at least you'd sparkle with the placebo glow. The allure of exotic imports was partly mystery. These substances came from lands of marvels described by travellers like Marco Polo. For a villager, holding a lump of resin from Arabia was like holding a fragment of another world. Burning it was a way of tasting the distant without leaving your parish. But imports sparked suspicion too. Critics muttered that such substances could tempt people into unnatural states, clouding reason and softening the spirit. The line between medicine, luxury and indulgence blurred dangerously close to sin. One monk even warned that too much incense could invite demons by opening false visions. Though honestly, that sounds more like a monk who hated sneezing. Still, medieval life wasn't sanitized. You walk through the market again, smoke rising from censers, sellers hawking powders, healers whispering recipes. Maybe you buy a crumb of resin yourself, tuck it in your pouch and wonder, will you burn it tonight for dreams or brew it for medicine? Either way, you're tangled in a web of trade that stretched from deserts to cathedrals, weaving scents, substances and stories into every corner of medieval life. By now you feel your clothes infused with incense, your hair catching the resin's perfume. Medieval imports weren't just things, they clung to you, seeped into walls, sanctuaries and lungs. They comforted the dying, entertained the living, and soothed the devout. They made you cough, yes, but they also made you dream. And so, leaving the market, you glance back at the haze of smoke curling over the crowd. Exotic, precious, feared, and desired. These resins and imports were more than trade goods. They were medieval portals, to prayer, to healing, to escape. You leave the smoky market behind, and the air sharpens as you climb a hillside toward a monastery. Bells toll faintly, and the world grows quieter, as though nature itself is holding its breath. Inside cloister walls, monks chant in Latin, their voices weaving through stone arches. But not all the visions here come from prayer alone. Welcome to the strange borderland where psychedelics and vision quests mingle with devotion, mysticism, and folk experiment. Imagine a medieval mystic fasting for days until her body trembles with weakness. Hunger itself can spark visions, brilliant lights, angelic voices, a sense of leaving one's body behind. Yet fasting was often paired with herbs, smokes, or brews that made the mind's walls thinner. You picture a nun sipping a bitter potion of henbane tea to calm her humours, only to drift into dreams where saints walk beside her. Was it holiness or hallucination? To her it didn't matter. The vision was real. Herbs like henbane, belladonna, and mandrake were notorious for stirring strange dreams. Mixed carefully, they could quiet pain or inspire trance. Mixed poorly, they could kill. Records show ointments rubbed on the skin, especially the witches' flying ointments whispered about by church inquisitors. These were said to let users believe they soared through the night sky, meeting spirits or devils. The ingredients, fat, herbs, oils, were psychoactive, absorbed through the skin. You imagine lying in a dark cottage, sweat beading on your forehead, while visions of flight carry you far beyond your bed. Not all visionary substances were tied to witchcraft. In monasteries, incense wasn't just about scent, it shaped inner states. Long hours inhaling frankincense could bring calm, mild dissociation, or even subtle euphoria. Combined with chanting and flickering candlelight, it could feel like the world dissolved. You picture yourself kneeling on cold stone, head swimming, as golden light shimmers into halos. Was it God or resin smoke? For medieval believers, that distinction was almost irrelevant. Some mystics pursued visions through deliberate suffering, sleep deprivation, cold vigils, or self-inflicted pain. But even these practices often used herbs to push the body further. A sprig of wormwood to stave off nausea, a pinch of poppy to dull exhaustion. Physical limits broke down, the mind slipped sideways, and visions of Christ or angels poured through. To a chronicler, these were miracles. To us they sound eerily like altered states. The link between visions and authority was powerful. A peasant woman claiming she saw the Virgin might be dismissed as mad. But if she described her visions in ways that matched church expectations, she could rise to sainthood. You imagine a barefoot girl trembling in ecstasy, recounting to a priest how angels touched her. Perhaps she had chewed a mandrake root beforehand. Did anyone care? Her words stirred faith, and that was enough. Folk traditions blurred the sacred and the profane. In villages, people used hallucinogenic herbs not for God but for divination, seeking lost items, predicting weather, or contacting spirits of the dead. An old healer might brew a henbane draught, sip carefully, then mutter predictions through her haze. Listeners leaned close, hoping truth glimmered in her visions. In such moments, community and chemistry intertwined, creating knowledge that felt both magical and practical. You also find tales of warriors drinking special brews before battle, fermented honey spiked with herbs like yarrow or possibly psychoactives. The effect wasn't necessarily peaceful visions, but frenzy, courage, a sense of being untouchable. Imagine a knight gripping his sword, sweat on his brow, heart hammering, not just from fear, but from the plants coursing through him. To an enemy he looked fearless. To himself perhaps he felt guided by saints. There's another layer, pilgrimage. Travellers often carried charms and potions for spiritual journeys. Some accounts describe holy herbs eaten on the road, said to sharpen devotion. A pilgrim trudging through mud might chew leaves to stay awake or feel closer to heaven. The boundary between stimulant and sacrament was slim, but dangers lurked. Medieval texts also warn of false visions, illusions sent by the devil to trick the unwary. Clergy sometimes accused visionary women of being deceived not by herbs but by demons. A woman writhing in ecstasy might inspire awe or suspicion. You picture villagers whispering, half admiring, half fearful, is she blessed or cursed? The line was razor thin. Even music and movement could be intoxicating when combined with substances. In some regions, festivals featured wild dances, with ale or herbal beers fueling the frenzy. People spun until they collapsed, convinced they'd touched other worlds. Chroniclers called it mania. Participants likely called it freedom, and so medieval vision quests weren't just about finding God, they were about pushing human limits, touching the unseen and breaking the ordinary. Herbs, smoke, fasting and ritual all work together. To modern eyes, it looks like psychedelics. To medieval eyes, it was revelation, miracle, or sometimes heresy. Picture yourself now, kneeling in a chapel, faint candlelight flickering, incense heavy in the air. You fasted for days, your belly hollow, your mind swimming. A monk hands you a cup of spiced wine laced with poppy. You drink, and warmth spreads through you. The chant rises, your eyelids flutter. The stone walls seem to melt. You see light, figures, wings. For a heartbeat, you believe you've glimpsed eternity. When you awaken, the vision clings like perfume. Was it God? Was it herbs? Perhaps it was both. In medieval Europe, psychedelics weren't hidden in subcultures as much as woven into the fabric of faith, folk medicine, and daily life. They opened doors to heaven, hell, and everything between. The quest wasn't about the plant or potion itself. It was about meaning. Each vision, however sparked, became part of the great story of human longing. As you leave the monastery, the bells fade, but your mind is still humming. You realize visions weren't accidents here. They were sought, cultivated, even celebrated. Psychedelics in the medieval world weren't just about escaping reality. They were about remaking it, one vision at a time. The monastery bells fade behind you as you wander back toward the village. The market stalls bustle again. Smoke curls from cottages, and the smell of stewing onions greets you. Here, far from scholars and monks, lies another world of medicine and intoxication, the everyday folk remedies carried in the minds and cupboards of ordinary people. This is where grandmothers, midwives and hedge witches ruled, where cures were passed from lip to ear, generation to generation, blurring comfort, ritual, and psychoactive secrets. Imagine stepping into a small timbered cottage. The hearth smoulders with embers, and above it hangs a bundle of drying plants. Rosemary for memory, sage for cleansing, wormwood for stomach aches, lavender to calm the restless. Each herb has a use, and some carry effects far stronger than their mild reputation suggests. The village healer knows which to brew gently, which to burn as smoke, and which to avoid except in desperation. Take poppy seeds, for instance. Children might be given a spoonful of poppy seed syrup to help them sleep. Just enough to hush the crying, a mother mutters, rocking a cradle. But that syrup also carried opium traces strong enough to stop breathing if overdone. For most, it was a blessing. Quiet nights in an age when illness and hunger kept families restless. For a few, it was a danger. The line between medicine and harm was walked carefully, usually guided by inherited wisdom rather than written texts. Another household plant was henbane, often hung in doorways to ward off spirits. In small doses, it soothed toothaches or muscle pains. In larger doses, it could bring vivid hallucinations. A grandmother might whisper, "Only a pinch, never a handful," as she ground the seeds into a paste. Yet stories spread of neighbours who saw devils after swallowing too much. In the village imagination, these weren't simply overdoses, they were journeys into other realms. Ale and beer, too, brewed in nearly every home, sometimes became folk remedies. Into the bubbling cauldron of malt, women added herbs like yarrow, wild rosemary, or even hemlock. Most additions were harmless, creating flavours or aiding digestion, but others had narcotic or stimulant properties. A mug of ale could therefore be both medicine and mild hallucinogen, depending on the recipe. You picture a winter evening where villagers gather around the fire drinking herb-rich ale that makes them laugh harder, sing longer, and perhaps see shadows moving strangely in the corners. Children weren't excluded from these remedies. A cloth soaked in meadowsweet or poppy infusion might be pressed against a teething baby's gums. It calms the spirit, women said. To modern ears it sounds alarming. But in an age without pharmacies, such practices were survival strategies. The herbs weren't luxuries, they were the family's first aid kit. Animals, too, received herbal care. A sick cow might be dosed with cannabis seeds or nettle decoctions. Shepherds swore that certain herbs cheered their flocks. Farmers sometimes ate the same preparations themselves, curious or desperate. Imagine a shepherd chewing leaves meant for his sheep, suddenly feeling dizzy under the open sky. Perhaps he thought he'd glimpsed angels, when in fact it was the plant talking. Superstition and healing walked side by side. A woman might scatter St. John's wort across the threshold to keep demons away, then steep it in wine for a neighbour's melancholy. Another might burn mugwort in the hearth to chase nightmares, believing the smoke carried protective power. Did it work? Sometimes belief itself was the strongest medicine. Yet many of these herbs also carried subtle psychoactive effects, calming nerves or brightening mood. Faith and chemistry merged seamlessly. Folk remedies weren't only about healing, they were also about divination. Villagers burned herbs to inhale the smoke before making decisions. A young girl might chew yarrow while asking who she would marry, waiting for dreams to reveal the answer. The bitterness of the herb numbed her tongue, and in her half-sleep she believed she saw her future husband's face. To her it was magic. To us it looks like mild intoxication shaping dreams. There was also pain management, especially for childbirth. Midwives kept secret recipes of brews made with valerian, poppy or mandrake to dull agony. These drinks didn't erase the suffering, but sometimes softened it enough for survival. The church often frowned on these practices, claiming suffering was part of divine will. Yet mothers knew painkillers could mean the difference between life and death. In this sense, folk remedies were quiet acts of defiance, placing survival above doctrine. Of course, accidents happened. Some villagers confused one root for another, leading to poisoning. Others drank too much of a sedative tea, slipping into stupor. Tales spread quickly. The old man saw demons before he died, warning future generations. Folklore became both memory and cautionary tale, teaching where science could not. What makes these everyday remedies striking is how normalized they were. In the city, physicians debated in Latin texts. In villages, cures lived in kitchens. The line between cooking and pharmacy was non-existent. A pinch of sage in stew wasn't just for flavour, it was for health. A draught of honey wine spiced with herbs wasn't just for merriment. It might also ease coughs or brighten the mood. Intoxication wasn't sought directly. It was simply part of life. Picture yourself sitting by the hearth in a small cottage. A woman hands you a steaming cup of ale brewed with yarrow and rosemary. You sip, and the warmth spreads through you. Outside, the wind howls, but inside you feel strangely light, your thoughts floating just above the fire's glow. The herbs buzz softly in your veins. Around you, villagers laugh, tell stories, and doze off in comfort. None of them think of it as drug use. For them, it is simply life. In the end, folk remedies reveal a truth. Medieval people weren't separate from the world of mind-altering substances. They lived in it daily, through plants, brews, smokes, and rituals. What was medicine to one was magic to another, and what was poison in one hand was salvation in another. These everyday practices shaped survival, belief, and even joy in an uncertain world. You step back into the night, the cottage door closing behind you. The smoke clings to your clothes, and the memory of the brew lingers. The ordinary folk of the Middle Ages weren't chasing ecstasy or escape. They were chasing health, love, safety, and meaning. And in their pursuit they stumbled into altered states as naturally as breathing. The night grows deep. You leave the village cottage behind, but the question lingers in your mind. When did medicine become vice? For centuries the boundary was thin. A sip of herb-laced ale calmed the nerves. A spoon of syrup silenced a cough. But slowly, across the Middle Ages, patterns of use shifted. Some substances began to be seen not only as healing gifts, but as temptations, doors that led away from God's path. Imagine walking now through the bustling streets of a medieval town at dusk. The taverns glow with torchlight. Inside, men slam mugs of ale on rough tables, laughter spilling out into the alley. The air smells of smoke, sweat, and brewing hops. For many, this was the heart of community life. Taverns were where news was shared, songs sung, and loneliness driven away. Yet, to the moralists of the time, these were also dens of sin. Alcohol especially began to wear two faces: medicine in the home, vice in the tavern. Chronic drunkenness became a theme in sermons. Priests thundered about the dangers of wine that drowns reason. The church wasn't against drink itself. Wine was part of Mass, beer safer than water, but against excess. In moderation, drink warmed the body and steadied the spirit. In excess, it bred violence, adultery, laziness. Here we see the medieval birth of a moral code around intoxication, the recognition that what healed in one dose could corrupt in another. Yet alcohol wasn't alone in shifting reputation. Consider opium, carried westward from the Islamic world. In medical texts it was praised as a divine painkiller, essential for surgery and unbearable fevers. But whispers spread of its dreaming powder, of students and courtiers who consumed it not for illness but for pleasure. In these stories, opium ceased to be purely medicinal and became associated with indulgence, temptation, and even sorcery. Though rare in everyday life, its reputation grew larger than its use. Likewise, plants like henbane, mandrake, and belladonna, once useful tools in the healer's cupboard, became stigmatized as instruments of witchcraft. Villagers who brewed them for pain relief risked suspicion. A midwife helping with childbirth might face accusations of consorting with the devil if her herbs were deemed too strange, too powerful. The psychoactive properties of these plants blurred into the fears of a society already haunted by demons and heresy. Thus, folk medicine crossed into forbidden magic, and altered states were recast as dangerous alliances with dark forces. This changing perception was deeply tied to control and authority. Physicians trained in universities wanted to separate their scientific medicine from the dangerous remedies of lay healers. The church wanted to separate holy sacraments from intoxication that led to sin. Secular rulers wanted to control taverns, markets, and the tax revenues from alcohol. What we call today the drug debate was, in the Middle Ages, a battle for defining who had the right to heal, who had the right to drink, and who had the right to alter consciousness at all. Yet even amid these warnings, people continued. Taverns filled each night, villagers still brewed herb-rich ales, midwives still used mandrake roots in secret, students still experimented with imported powders, ordinary life resisted strict rules. People needed relief, laughter, warmth, and sometimes escape. For them, intoxication was not primarily a moral issue. It was part of being human. Travellers left behind fascinating glimpses of this duality. One merchant wrote of a town where wine runs as freely as water, and men collapse in the streets while priests scold them on the morrow. Another described an apothecary selling powders that promised not only to heal but to bring vivid dreams. These reports carried both fascination and judgment, showing how deeply ambivalent medieval society was towards substances that touched both body and soul. Picture yourself stepping into one of these taverns. The ale is thick and sweet, brewed with honey and spices. The crowd sings bawdy songs, their voices half joyful, half desperate. For some, this is liberation from toil. For others, it is ruin. You drink, and the warmth spreads. Not unlike the village brew you tried earlier, but here the intent feels different. It is no longer just medicine, it is escape. You realise you're witnessing the moment when remedies transform into recreation, and recreation transforms into vice. But there is another layer, the sacred. Even as intoxication was condemned in taverns, it was embraced in ritual. Wine in the Eucharist was holy. Incense smoke filled churches, lifting prayers heavenward and creating a sensory atmosphere that altered consciousness in a different, sanctified way. What separated this from tavern drunkenness was not the substance itself, but its framing. Intoxication as divine communion, not carnal indulgence. By the late Middle Ages, the landscape of drugs and drink was marked by contradictions. Substances were at once indispensable and suspect, holy and sinful, medicinal and recreational. The people lived inside these contradictions every day. They brewed, drank, smoked, and dosed, then confessed, repented, or denied. This was not hypocrisy. It was survival within a world of strict doctrine and fragile bodies. As you walk out of the tavern into the midnight air, you sense how close these lines still are today. The medieval struggle between medicine and vice, relief and indulgence, science and superstition, still echoes in our modern debates. What is addiction? What is healing? What is spirituality? The answers are never simple. The bells toll again. Your journey through medieval medicine and mind-altering substances comes to its close. You have stood in monasteries with sober scholars, in fields with villagers drying herbs, in taverns where songs drowned in drink, and in churches where incense sanctified the air. Each setting revealed the same truth. Humanity has always walked a fine line between healing the body and altering the mind. As dawn breaks, you reflect. Perhaps what defines a drug, whether medicine or vice, has less to do with the plant or powder itself, and more with the stories we tell about it, the power we grant it, the fear we attach to it, the hope we pour into it. And those stories, like the substances, never truly disappear. They linger like smoke, carried from the medieval world into our own. As the candles burn lower in your imagination, the world of medieval remedies and intoxicants begins to fade into a gentler haze. The clamour of taverns, the smoky incense of churches, the jars of apothecaries, all slowly recede like distant echoes carried away on the night air. You can almost feel the cobblestone beneath your feet soften, the sharp edges of history rounding into something more dreamlike, more forgiving. Your breath slows, as if you're no longer trudging through crowded marketplaces or leaning over mysterious brews, but resting quietly in a safe chamber of your own. The bottles, the roots, the powders, each one drifts out of reach, and with them the weight of curiosity begins to lighten. It is enough to know you walked among them, enough to know you glimpsed the strangeness of their world. There is comfort now in realizing that every age, even one filled with confusion and risk, carries the same human longing to find relief, to find meaning, to find a small measure of peace. That thought itself is a lullaby, soft and steady, reminding you that people long ago were not so different from you. They laughed, they searched, they stumbled, they dreamed, and so you let the images blur. Monks bent over manuscripts, healers whispering incantations, merchants packing their bundles for faraway roads. They passed gently through your thoughts, like shadows across moonlit walls. Soon even those dissolve into the quiet. Let your eyes grow heavy. Let your mind settle into stillness. History has carried you far tonight, and now it sets you gently back into your own time, your own bed, your own breath. Safe, steady, calm. Sleep now, and may your dreams be kind. If you're still awake, don't worry. We'll be right here with you tonight, and together we'll drift into our second story. We slip into the dim and smoky world of the Middle Ages, where the line between medicine and magic blurs so much you might forget which is which. You walk down a narrow cobblestone street lit only by flickering torches, the air thick with the smell of damp hay, smoke from wood fires, and something faintly sour that could be last week's chamber pot dumped out too close to your boots. People are coughing, children cry in the shadows, and every corner hides someone whispering about a cure for fevers, a spell to banish pain, or a potion that promises way more than it can deliver. You can almost feel the unease under your skin, because here, a headache isn't just a headache. It might be a curse, a punishment, or worse, the start of something that no medieval doctor has a clue how to stop. And trust me, you probably wouldn't survive this world of strange remedies, at least not for long. Your sandals scuff against the uneven stones as you pass stalls selling herbs bundled in rough twine, powders kept in cracked ceramic jars, and even dried animal parts dangling like trophies from hooks. Medieval medicine is alive and buzzing here, but not in the way you might imagine hospitals or pharmacies today. There are no gleaming white walls, no clipboards, no neat rows of labelled bottles. Instead, you hear the groan of a sick man being dragged toward a barber surgeon's chair, see the glint of steel that's been rinsed in nothing more than a bucket of rainwater, and smell the pungent mix of vinegar, sweat, and clove meant to mask the odour of sickness. Doctors, or physicians as they're called, are rare and expensive. Most people can't afford them, so they rely on herbalists, travelling healers, monks, or even neighbours who swear by recipes passed down through family lines. And remember, back then, medicine isn't just about the body. It's about the soul, the stars, and whatever spirits might be lurking just out of sight. Healing means prayer, astrology, ritual, and sometimes a willingness to swallow something you'd rather not think about. Historians still argue whether medieval medicine helped more people than it harmed, or if it was basically an elaborate placebo with a dash of accidental poisoning. But for the people living it, the choice was simple. Try the cure, however strange, or face the illness head-on. You'd take the risk too, wouldn't you? Imagine being led into a dark hut, where a healer waves smoke from burning rosemary around your head. The crackle of the herbs on the fire fills the silence, and the healer mutters words you can't quite catch. Is it a prayer? A charm? Both, maybe. Then she hands you a small clay cup filled with liquid so bitter it curls your tongue. You choke it down anyway, because that cup might mean the difference between life and death, or at least between another week of fever and a chance at recovery. It's not all herbs and chanting, though. Medieval Europe thrives on odd mixtures of superstition and practicality. For instance, one recorded cure for epilepsy involved wearing a dead man's tooth around your neck, like a necklace of very questionable fashion. Another treatment for baldness suggested rubbing the ashes of burnt bees onto your scalp. You picture yourself explaining that at a medieval dinner party. Yes, I've been wearing molar jewellery and bee dust. It's all the rage. 3 jokes in, and you're still scratching your head, maybe literally. Mainstream medical knowledge centres on the 4 humours: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. The belief is that health comes from keeping these in balance, and sickness means one of them has gone rogue. The system makes sense in its own poetic way. If you're too hot, maybe you've got too much blood. If you're sluggish, perhaps phlegm is to blame. And so, treatments aim to cool, heat, dry, or moisten you, sometimes with foods, sometimes with leeches, sometimes with, well, things you don't really want applied to your skin. Here in the bustling medieval street you pass a cart where a vendor loudly insists that powdered stag antlers cure fatigue, while another swears by dried frog legs to soothe colds. There's no FDA stamp of approval, no double-blind studies, just a strong voice and a promise. And yet, for some people, these strange cures work. Whether by the placebo effect or sheer coincidence, we'll never fully know. Historians still argue whether belief itself acted as medicine, and honestly, walking here, you start to believe it could. Some remedies, though, are darker. You overhear someone whisper about a potion made from ground-up mummy imported from Egypt, sold in tiny amounts at outrageous prices. Imagine that. You're sipping dust from a long-dead pharaoh because someone promised it would cure headaches. The thought chills you, but in the Middle Ages, the stranger the cure, the more powerful it seems. Scarcity equals magic, and yet, within all this chaos, there's an undeniable sense of human determination. People refuse to give up. They mix, grind, chant, and swallow whatever might keep them alive one more day. You can almost admire it, even as you wrinkle your nose at the smell of fox liver stew being simmered nearby. It's gross, but it's survival. As the torches gutter low and the street settles into a restless medieval night, you realise you're only at the start of this journey. The strangeness will only deepen, the cures will get weirder, and your tolerance for the bizarre will be tested. But here you are, leaning forward, ready to keep going. You wake up to the clang of church bells echoing over a medieval town square, the sound reverberating through narrow streets crowded with vendors and beggars. Morning light filters through a haze of chimney smoke, and already you hear coughing, sneezing, and groaning from the people around you. Illness is everywhere, stitched into the fabric of daily life, and fear lurks behind every glance. In this world, disease isn't explained by bacteria or viruses. Germs are centuries away from being understood. Instead, sickness is seen as a punishment from God, a misalignment of your inner humours, or the sinister work of invisible miasmas drifting in from swamps and graveyards. You watch as a town crier announces the spread of yet another fever sweeping through nearby villages. People cross themselves hurriedly, muttering prayers, while others rush toward herbal stalls, desperate to buy anything that promises safety. Remedies are rarely gentle. They're rough, experimental, and sometimes more dangerous than the illness itself. You'd better keep your cloak close and your trust even closer, because the wrong cure might send you straight from bed to burial. Take the barber surgeon's booth, for instance. His striped pole marks him out not only as a trimmer of beards, but also as a bleeder of veins. The man in front of you rolls up his sleeve, grimacing as a blade slices across his skin. A clay bowl is placed beneath his arm to catch the blood, dark and hot as it drips steadily. The theory? Too much blood makes you feverish, restless, or delirious. By draining it, balance is supposedly restored. You might want to faint at the sight, but the patient believes this will save him. Historians still argue whether bloodletting offered real relief through reduced pressure, or was merely a slow-motion disaster disguised as treatment. Nearby, another man stirs a pot of leeches writhing in water. He claims these squirming creatures are more precise than knives, nibbling gently until they've sucked just enough. If you're squeamish, look away. But in the Middle Ages, leeches are big business. Monasteries even raised them in ponds, harvesting the slimy creatures as if they were precious herbs. Imagine that as your side hustle. Yes, I farm leeches. No, I don't want to shake your hand. Not every remedy is so bloody, though. Some cures are downright bizarre in their creativity. For example, to treat gout, physicians sometimes recommended roasting a live owl, grinding its ashes into powder and mixing it with wine. You picture yourself explaining this to a modern doctor. "Doc, I took my owl supplement, but my foot still hurts." That's joke number one, although back then it wasn't funny at all. And then there are the astrological healers, gazing at the night sky, scribbling charts, and insisting that your illness has everything to do with the position of Saturn or Mars. Got a stomachache? Perhaps Venus is to blame. A rash? Blame Jupiter's alignment. While it sounds wild, astrology was once a central part of medicine, guiding when surgeries should happen and when medicines should be mixed. Historians still debate whether these alignments provided psychological comfort or simply gave physicians a convenient excuse when treatments failed. The Church, of course, has its own perspective. Sickness is sometimes punishment for sin, and confession, prayer, or pilgrimages are offered as the ultimate cures. You walk past a shrine where wax figures, tiny replicas of arms, legs, or even entire torsos, are hung as offerings, each representing a part of the body someone hopes will be healed. The air is thick with candle smoke and whispered pleas. Whether or not miracles happen, the act of belief itself offers a sense of control in a world that feels uncontrollable. Still, desperation breeds creativity, and sometimes cures spill into the realm of the downright unappetizing. For instance, one treatment for epilepsy involved drinking the blood of a freshly killed gladiator in Roman times, a practice that, believe it or not, lingers in medieval whispers. In rural corners of Europe, people experiment with similar ideas, convinced that life force can transfer through blood. Don't worry, I won't suggest you try it. You probably won't survive this. That's joke number 2. Back in the marketplace, an old woman sells sachets of herbs stuffed with lavender, sage, and rosemary. She swears the scent wards off the plague. It's called a pomander, and people hang them from their necks or tuck them in their sleeves. Do they work? Maybe not in the way we'd define today, but keeping a bit of rosemary in your pocket certainly smells nicer than the rest of medieval hygiene. Sometimes, comfort is half the cure. And if the pomander doesn't work, there's always fumigation. You watch as a family tosses handfuls of juniper into a fire, filling their house with thick, eye-watering smoke. The belief is that bad air causes sickness, so cleansing the atmosphere with pungent herbs might keep death at bay. Whether it actually stops disease or simply chases away visitors, historians still argue about its effectiveness. Then there's urine therapy. Yes, you heard that right. Physicians sometimes recommend tasting, smelling, and even drinking urine as both diagnosis and cure. You cringe at the thought, but in their defense, colour and scent can reveal signs of dehydration or infection, though the drinking part is definitely unnecessary. Imagine bringing that up at a medieval dinner party. Would you like red wine, white wine, or urine? That's joke number 3, and probably enough to put you off your appetite. Walking through this world of strange treatments, you realise that fear drives much of it. Disease sweeps through villages without warning, and people cling to whatever shred of hope they can. Whether it's herbs, leeches, or the alignment of stars, each cure reflects an attempt to bring order to chaos. You might laugh from the safety of modern medicine, but if you were sick back then, you'd probably clutch that pomander just as tightly. As the day fades into twilight, smoke from hearth fires curls upward, carrying with it the mingled scents of rosemary, blood, and something faintly sour. You're left wondering whether these cures ever truly worked, or if survival was just a roll of the dice. Either way, you're still walking, still breathing, and still curious about what stranger remedies await you next. The chill of evening settles in as you wander deeper into the medieval town, and the sounds of the market fade into the quiet hum of hearths being stoked and doors being barred against the night. You turn down a narrow alley where the pungent aroma of dried herbs, roots and powders drifts through a wooden door cracked open. Inside, a physician's chamber glows with candlelight, its shelves sagging under jars of strange substances, powdered horn, dried beetles, even something labelled unicorn. Welcome to the world of humoral balance, where medicine is less about what you take and more about what you balance within. According to medieval belief, your body is governed by 4 humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. If these liquids slosh about in the right proportions, you feel fine. If they tip too far one way or another, you're suddenly pale, feverish, or convinced that Saturn is sitting on your chest. So every cure begins with the same principle: restore balance at any cost. Take, for example, a fever. You sit across from the physician, your face hot and flushed. He strokes his beard, nods gravely, and mutters that you have an excess of blood. The cure? Bleeding, of course. Or maybe a diet of cooling foods like cucumbers, lettuce, or even sour milk. If that doesn't work, you might be prescribed a walk under the moonlight, as if fresh night air could tug your humours back into place. Historians still argue whether these treatments provided comfort simply because they encouraged rest and hydration, or whether they genuinely had any medicinal effect. Then there's phlegm, sticky, cold and sluggish. Too much of it, and you're congested, coughing or lethargic. The cure? Heat and dryness. A doctor might mix you a fiery potion of pepper, ginger and cinnamon steeped in hot wine. Sounds like a medieval version of mulled cider, right? Joke number 1. You almost want to sip it at Christmas, though I wouldn't recommend it for your next cold. Yellow bile, the humour of heat and anger, is a trickier beast. Too much of it, and you're vomiting, irritable or downright furious at your neighbour's noisy chickens. The physician prescribes cooling herbs, mint, violets, or lettuce, and perhaps a swim in a cold river. You imagine explaining this to your boss today. "Sorry I yelled. I had excess yellow bile. I'll take a dip in the river and be fine." Black bile, though, is the most sinister. Associated with sadness and melancholy, it's whispered to cause not only depression but even strange visions. To treat it, a doctor might recommend a purge, strong laxatives made from senna, aloe, or even boiled down ox gall. Picture it. I'm sad, so I'll drink cow bile. Joke number 2. Medieval therapy wasn't exactly known for subtlety. Not every patient, of course, can afford a physician. Many rely on the neighbourhood wise woman, her remedies drawn not from scholarly texts, but from generations of whispered recipes. She crushes herbs with a mortar and pestle, stirring in honey or vinegar, always mindful of the humours yet guided by something more intuitive. One of her concoctions for melancholy might include St. John's wort, which, as modern science later discovered, actually can ease mild depression. Sometimes the old wives knew more than the so-called experts in gowns and caps. And speaking of experts, university-trained physicians guard their knowledge with pomp and Latin incantations. You can almost hear one now declaiming about Galen, the ancient Greek physician whose writings dominate medieval thought. His texts are copied and recopied, each ink stroke reinforcing the idea that health is a careful dance of humours. Historians still debate whether Galen's dominance stifled innovation or preserved a vital framework until modern medicine was ready to leap forward. One especially quirky tidbit. Physicians sometimes matched humours with the seasons. Spring belonged to blood, summer to yellow bile, autumn to black bile, and winter to phlegm. So if you caught a cold in winter, well, that was simply nature aligning with your phlegmatic humours. You could almost imagine someone sneezing and then sighing, classic winter phlegm season. Joke number 3. Imagine posting that on social media. Phlegm season. But humoral theory didn't just shape medicine, it shaped diets, exercise, even sleeping habits. A patient with too much black bile might be told to avoid heavy meats and instead eat figs, prunes, or lentils. A choleric person, brimming with yellow bile, might be forbidden spicy foods and told to stick to cucumbers. Suddenly, you realise medieval diet culture wasn't about losing weight. It was about surviving your own internal soup. Of course, balance isn't only internal. Physicians believe the stars also tug at your humours, so before prescribing, some consult astrological charts. If Mars dominates, perhaps your blood boils hotter. If Saturn looms, melancholy deepens. Whether this was medicine or mysticism, historians still argue, but to medieval patients, it all felt deeply connected. As the physician scribbles a prescription in Latin, maybe a syrup of violets for your fever, you glance again at his shelves. Unicorn horn powder sits in a jar, though more likely it's powdered narwhal tusk imported at great expense. Rich patients pay dearly for it, convinced it protects against poison. The irony? Narwhal tusks don't detoxify anything, but powdered ivory probably didn't hurt either, unless it drained your purse. Leaving the chamber, you step into the night, your head swimming with the idea that your body is a bubbling cauldron of humours, tipping and spilling with every meal, mood, and season. And though you can't help chuckling at the thought of cow bile tea or des phlegm season, you also sense the earnestness in these cures. In a world where sickness is constant, humoral balance offers a map, a way to navigate chaos with rules however flawed. You follow the faint glow of torches along the muddy street, and soon the hushed whispers of townsfolk guide you toward a shadowy building marked with a faded red cross. Inside, a different world of medicine unfolds, a monastery infirmary where the scent of beeswax candles mingles with pungent herbs hanging from rafters. Here, medicine wears a robe and a prayer book. Monks and nuns serve not only as spiritual caretakers but also as healers. Their libraries brim with manuscripts, many copied by hand in patient looping script. These texts preserve the medical wisdom of Galen and Hippocrates, blended with local herbal lore and sprinkled with passages from scripture. Healing, after all, is as much about saving the soul as mending the body. You picture a monk leaning over a patient's bed, murmuring psalms while applying a poultice of crushed sage leaves to an infected wound. One mainstream fact stands out. Monasteries often function as the closest thing to hospitals in medieval Europe. Travellers, peasants, and nobles alike sometimes find refuge within their stone walls, treated with herbal remedies and fed broths that, at the very least, provide warmth and nourishment. Historians still argue whether these infirmaries genuinely improve survival rates, or whether their greatest gift was simply shelter and rest. The remedies here can seem simple compared to the pomp of university physicians. A patient with stomach pains might be given chamomile tea, a practice still soothing today. Someone with a fever may be washed with cool water infused with rose petals. You realise with a smile that these cures sound almost spa-like, though the stone floors, draughty halls and chanting monks probably ruin the relaxation vibe. Joke number 1. Imagine trying to nap during your treatment while Brother Matthew drones through the entire book of Psalms. Yet tucked into these monasteries are stranger practices too. A common cure for epilepsy, for instance, might involve drinking the blood of a freshly killed animal, sometimes even a rooster. The logic? Life force resides in blood, and by consuming it, you might balance what was missing in your own body. It's unsettling, yes, but it reveals how spiritual belief, symbolism, and physical health were intertwined. And then there are relics, bones, teeth, or garments of saints, believed to hold miraculous healing power. Pilgrims flock to touch or kiss them, hoping for relief from blindness, lameness, or plague. Was it placebo? Divine intervention? Historians still debate whether relics were simply psychological comfort, or whether they fostered genuine recoveries born from faith and rest. But for medieval patients, these relics offered hope in a world of constant uncertainty. The monks themselves lived by strict rules, waking before dawn, fasting, and labouring in the gardens where their medicines grow. You can picture them tending to rows of fennel, lavender, sage, and rue, plants that double as food and pharmacy. Sage for digestion, lavender for sleep, rue for expelling worms. And let's not forget garlic, prized for its ability to ward off infection and, according to one quirky tidbit, even evil spirits. Honestly, between its smell and its power against bacteria, garlic probably kept both demons and dinner guests away. Joke number 2. Eat garlic, stay healthy, and stay single. Monasteries don't just treat people, they also preserve knowledge. Without them, many ancient texts might have vanished during the chaos of the early Middle Ages. Through diligent copying, monks pass along recipes, observations, and even magical charms. Sometimes these charms involve writing verses on parchment and tying them to a patient's body. Whether that works or not, you can imagine the patient thinking, "At least someone cares enough to try." But monks also practice bloodletting, aligning with humoral theory. You can almost hear the scrape of a razor as it nicks a vein, a bowl filling with dark liquid. The patient lies weak but hopeful, convinced the imbalance is draining away. It feels crude, even dangerous. But for centuries this act symbolizes medicine itself. Historians still argue whether frequent bloodletting shortened lives or whether occasional, careful use provided relief from certain conditions like high blood pressure. Some cures take a more mystical turn. For toothaches, monks might recite a prayer to Saint Apollonia, patron saint of teeth, while pressing cloves against the gums. For fevers, they might trace the sign of the cross over the patient's chest. Medicine here is inseparable from religion, body and soul treated as one. Even the infirmary's layout reflects this blend. Patients lie in rows of beds beneath a chapel-like ceiling, their moans echoing alongside chants from the choir. Healing isn't just physical, it's spiritual alignment. A patient may recover not because of the herbs, but because they've been given peace, rest, and a sense of divine attention. Joke number 3. You could say medieval hospitals offered the first all-inclusive retreat package: food, prayer, and an herbal cleanse, minus the infinity pool. And yet, despite the prayers and charms, death is always near. Monks bury their patients in adjoining graveyards, reciting prayers for souls that medicine cannot save. This constant proximity to mortality shapes their approach. Medicine isn't always about cure, but about comfort, dignity, and preparing for the next life. As you leave the monastery, you glance back at its looming stone walls. The chants drift into the night air, mingling with the smell of rosemary from the gardens. You can't help but feel torn, half amused at the garlic charms and rooster blood remedies, half touched by the compassion of these healers. For in a world so fragile, even imperfect medicine offered hope, and hope itself was sometimes the strongest cure. The air grows colder as you wander past the monastery gardens, and soon your feet crunch along a dirt road lined with crooked cottages. A faint reek lingers, something metallic mixed with mildew, and you realise you're approaching the home of a barber surgeon. Unlike the quiet, scripture-filled infirmary, this is medicine in its most hands-on, messy form. Here, steel and sweat define healing. The barber surgeon is an odd character. Half hairdresser, half doctor, part entertainer. His striped pole, a symbol still used today outside barbershops, originates from this era. The red represents blood, the white bandages, and the pole itself. That's the stick patients squeezed while having their veins opened. A stylish piece of branding, if you think about it, though not exactly the kind of marketing you'd want outside your local spa. Joke number 1. Need a haircut and a leg amputation. 2-for-1 special today. Inside his dim shop, the tools glint in candlelight. Razors, knives, hooks, and a bone saw. They're not sterilised, of course. Antiseptics won't exist for centuries. Instead, the barber wipes blades with a rag, sharpens them on a stone, and dives straight into his work. Patients sit on a stool, gripping the armrest or biting down on leather. You can almost hear their muffled groans as the blade slices flesh. Mainstream historical fact. Barber surgeons were widely employed across medieval towns, performing everything from tooth extractions to amputations, wound stitching, and even trepanation. The drilling of holes into the skull to relieve pressure or release supposed evil spirits. These procedures often saved lives in cases of trauma, though infections afterward were common. Historians still argue whether barber surgeons were genuine professionals or simply opportunists exploiting desperate patients. Some view them as precursors to modern surgery, while others see them as butchers in aprons. And the patients kept coming because there were few alternatives. Imagine a soldier staggering in after battle, his arm mangled. A university physician might refuse to touch him, deeming surgery beneath his scholarly dignity. But the barber surgeon grabs his knife, heats iron in the fire, and prepares to cut. He knows speed is key. The faster he saws, the more chance his patient has of surviving the shock. You can almost hear the sizzling hiss of hot metal as it cauterizes the wound. Effective, yes, but the smell of burning flesh. Not exactly the kind of aromatherapy you'd order. Joke number 2. Forget scented candles. This place runs on odour-roasted ankle. Alongside amputations, barber surgeons excel at bloodletting. Patients with fever, gout, or headaches line up for the procedure, believing it balances their humours. The barber ties a cord around the arm, pricks a vein, and watches crimson pour into a bowl. Sometimes the patient faints, sometimes they feel better, and sometimes they never wake again. Still, people keep trusting the process, because in a world without antibiotics, it feels like doing something is better than nothing. But there are quirkier treatments too. For instance, barber surgeons might recommend applying spider webs to wounds as a kind of bandage. The sticky silk supposedly helps stop bleeding and prevent infection. Modern science actually backs this up slightly. Spider silk has mild antibacterial properties. Of course, it also has the drawback of housing the occasional spider, which is not exactly reassuring when it crawls across your cut. And then there's trepanation, the ultimate test of bravery or desperation. A patient with seizures or migraines lies still while the barber surgeon bores into their skull with a hand drill. The goal is to let out pressure or bad spirits, and surprisingly, many skulls show signs of healing afterward, meaning patients survived. Historians still argue whether the relief was real, placebo, or just dumb luck. Either way, the fact that anyone lived through it without antiseptic or anesthesia is mind-boggling. You notice how barber surgeons aren't just healers, but also performers. They often set up in marketplaces, drawing crowds as they pulled teeth with dramatic flair, holding the bloody molar aloft like a trophy. The crowd cheers, the patient reels, and business booms. In some cases, they even sang or told jokes during the procedure, distracting patients with humour while yanking out molars. Joke number 3. The medieval version of Netflix and chill was more like tooth pull and scream. Despite their rough methods, barber surgeons become indispensable during wars and plagues. Armies hire them to tend to wounded soldiers, and towns rely on them when epidemics strike. They stitch cuts, drain abscesses, and set broken bones, skills that, despite the lack of hygiene, often make the difference between survival and certain death, and yet their reputation wavers. Learned physicians dismiss them as uneducated hacks, while ordinary people praise their practical skill. You're left with the sense that medieval medicine was a hierarchy. Physicians theorized, monks prayed, and barber surgeons got their hands dirty. Each played a role, and each had its risks. As you leave the barber's dim shop, the sound of the saw still lingers in your ears, mingling with the metallic tang of blood in the air. You step into the night, both horrified and oddly impressed. Because in their crude way, barber surgeons were pioneers, testing the limits of flesh, steel, and survival, centuries before antiseptic science would catch up. The road bends, and soon you find yourself beneath the shadow of a castle. Torches flicker in the high windows, and the clang of weapons echoes faintly from the courtyard. Within these stone walls, medicine takes a different form, practical, immediate, and often terrifying. Here, physicians are scarce, and soldiers depend on battlefield remedies, improvised cures, and a grim determination to survive. Imagine the chaos of a medieval battlefield. Arrows whistling, swords clashing, horses shrieking. A soldier stumbles back to camp with a gash down his thigh, blood soaking his tunic. No sterile hospital awaits him, just a makeshift tent where a surgeon, often trained in barbering rather than medicine, crouches over a wooden table. The wound must be cleaned, stitched, and sometimes cauterized, all without anesthesia. The patient bites a stick, screams into a rag, or passes out. The smell of iron, sweat, and fire fills the air. Mainstream historical fact. Cauterization with a red-hot iron was one of the most common battlefield techniques, used to stop bleeding and close wounds. While it reduced the immediate risk of hemorrhage, it also carried a huge risk of infection. Yet, soldiers sometimes survived, a testament to sheer resilience. Historians still argue whether battlefield surgery advanced medical knowledge or merely repeated the same brutal mistakes until luck favoured a few. Alongside blades and burning irons, soldiers relied heavily on herbal poultices. Yarrow leaves, known as soldier's woundwort, were crushed and pressed into cuts to stop bleeding. Plantain, another common herb, was applied to draw out infection. These remedies might sound quaint, but modern science shows some of these plants contain mild antibacterial or clotting properties. In other words, medieval soldiers sometimes benefited from a touch of accidental pharmacology. Of course, not all treatments were so rational. Some warriors carried charms or amulets inscribed with prayers, believing these protected wounds from festering. Others recited incantations over their injuries, or even applied powdered mummy, ground-up remains imported from Egypt, thought to hold healing power. Imagine rubbing centuries-old pharaoh dust into your arrow wound. Joke number 1. Talk about ancient remedies, literally ancient. Quirky battlefield trick. Some armies used moss scraped from trees to pack wounds. Not just any moss. It absorbed blood, swelling like a primitive bandage. Centuries later, sphagnum moss would be used again in World War I as a sterile dressing. Sometimes, medieval medicine stumbled onto effective techniques long before science explained them. You also encounter battlefield dentistry, because soldiers didn't just lose arms, they lost teeth. Lacking proper dental care, warriors often relied on comrades to yank out rotten molars with pliers or even daggers. The medic then stuffed the bleeding socket with herbs or cloth. Soldiers joked grimly about their comrades doubling as dentists. Joke number 2. 1 minute he's sharpening his sword, the next he's pulling molars. Medieval multitasking at its finest. Even broken bones received attention. Splints fashioned from wooden sticks and cloth strips were used to immobilize limbs. Sometimes bones were set by brute force, with 2 men pulling in opposite directions while the surgeon pushed. The snapping sound of a bone realigned was followed by a prayer and maybe a gulp of ale. No guarantees, of course. Some healed crooked, others not at all. There were also battlefield concoctions brewed on the spot. Wine was poured over wounds, not because of its bouquet, but because it stung less than water and killed some bacteria. Soldiers dreaded the sting but welcomed the cleanliness compared to filthy river water. Historians still argue whether wine's antiseptic value saved more lives than it ruined, given alcohol also irritated tissue. But in an age without antiseptic, every drop felt like liquid salvation. And then there's trepanation, again making an appearance. If a soldier's skull cracked under a mace or helmet dented from a blow, surgeons sometimes drilled into the bone to relieve swelling. It sounds barbaric, but some men survived, living to fight another day. Archaeologists find healed skulls with circular holes, proof of both survival and astonishing medieval grit. In the thick of war, battlefield medicine wasn't just about survival, it was also about morale. Soldiers needed to see their comrades treated, even crudely, to believe recovery was possible. Imagine the confidence it gave, watching a fellow fighter stitched up, bandaged and limping back to his post. The illusion of care was as important as the care itself. Joke number 3. Nothing says team spirit like sharing bandages and fleas in the same tent. And of course there were failures. Infection, gangrene and tetanus claimed more soldiers than swords did. A cut that looked minor one day could swell into a feverish death sentence the next. To fight it, some surgeons mixed foul-smelling ointments of honey, lard and herbs, smearing them into wounds with their bare hands. It wasn't sterile, but sometimes honey's natural antibacterial properties helped. Other times, it simply made you smell like a pastry before you died. As you leave the castle yard, you hear the faint groans of injured men and the clink of metal tools being cleaned in buckets of cold water. The battlefield is a brutal teacher, and medicine here is forged in urgency. Soldiers live or die by crude experiments, shaping knowledge one scar at a time. You step back into the night, the image of glowing irons and trembling hands etched into your mind. In this world, bravery isn't just facing the enemy. It's lying on a wooden table, staring at the ceiling and trusting the man with the knife. You push farther along the winding medieval road and stumble into the heart of a bustling town. The air is thick with smoke from cooking fires, the tang of tanned leather, and the unmistakable funk of humanity crammed into narrow streets. Here, medicine is no longer confined to monasteries or battlefields. It's embedded into everyday life, woven into the fabric of the marketplace, where apothecaries, barber surgeons, and travelling healers compete for customers. Picture an apothecary's shop, wooden shelves sagging beneath jars of dried herbs, powders, and tinctures. Strange smells waft through the air, mint sharp enough to clear your sinuses, cinnamon sweet enough to make your stomach growl, and sulphur that makes you gag a little. A mortar and pestle clink rhythmically as the apothecary grinds roots into powder. Customers whisper ailments, anything from aching joints to lovesickness, and the apothecary prescribes mixtures with the confidence of someone who might not actually know if they work. Mainstream historical fact. Apothecaries were central figures in medieval urban life, precursors to modern pharmacists. They sold remedies, advised patients, and sometimes prepared treatments for physicians. Their shops doubled as social hubs where gossip mixed with medicine. Historians still argue whether apothecaries pushed legitimate remedies or just made fortunes off superstition and placebo. Quirky tidbit. Some apothecaries sold unicorn horn powder, allegedly ground from the spiral tusk of a narwhal. It was marketed as a cure for poison, infertility, and bad luck. Basically medieval snake oil with an expensive price tag. Wealthy nobles carried little vials of it as protective charms, showing off their status while hoping it would save them from a bad oyster at dinner. Joke 1. Imagine paying a year's wages for ground-up sea mammal teeth. Talk about a scam with bite. But the apothecary wasn't the only option. Just around the corner you'd find the barber surgeon's pole, striped red and white, the familiar sign that once advertised not only haircuts, but also bloodletting, tooth extractions and minor surgery. Step inside, and you'd hear the scrape of razors, the groans of patients, and the splash of blood into a basin. Need a boil lanced? The barber's got you. Toothache? Out it comes. Headache? A quick bloodletting might fix that, or make you faint. Bloodletting was the cure-all of the age based on the belief in balancing the four humours: blood, phlegm, black bile and yellow bile. Too much blood? Easy fix. Open a vein. Leeches were also used, their slippery bodies clinging to flesh, drinking until they swelled like grapes. Patients tolerated it because everyone believed imbalance caused illness. Historians still debate whether bloodletting sometimes relieved pressure in conditions like hypertension, or if it just weakened people further. Either way, it remained one of the most popular treatments for centuries. In the market square, travelling quacks performed loud demonstrations. They pulled worms from ears, which were really bits of cotton, or claimed to cure blindness with powders that stung so badly patients couldn't keep their eyes open. Spectators clapped, tossed coins, and left convinced, at least until the placebo wore off. The travelling healer was part medicine, part theatre, and part scam artist. Joke 2. Think of them as medieval infomercials. Buy now, side effects guaranteed later. Meanwhile, the average townsfolk often trusted remedies passed down through family traditions. A mother might soothe her child's cough with syrup made of honey and onion, while a grandmother whispered charms over a fever. Healing wasn't only about plants and powders, it was about belief, ritual, and comfort. People wanted to feel cared for, even if the cure was more emotional than physical. The urban poor often turned to charms and amulets, a leather pouch with a saint's relic, a scrap of parchment inscribed with a prayer, or even dried toad parts tied to a string. These were seen as shields against illness. Sometimes they were worn openly, other times tucked under clothing, hidden like secret armour. The power wasn't in the item itself, but in the faith people placed in it. Not all remedies were harmless. Arsenic powders were sold for skin conditions, mercury was rubbed onto sores to cleanse them, and lead-based ointments promised to heal wounds. Of course, they often poisoned people slowly. It's easy to laugh now, but remember, these substances gave quick, visible results, even if they caused long-term harm. Joke 3. Imagine going in for a rash cream and walking out with lead poisoning, medieval customer service at its finest. Despite the chaos, real progress lurked in these busy streets. Some apothecaries kept detailed recipe books, carefully noting what seemed to help and what didn't. Others imported exotic spices and plants from trade routes, broadening Europe's medical horizons. Clove, ginger and nutmeg weren't just for flavour, they were mixed into tonics believed to strengthen the stomach or ward off plague. In some cases, the global spice trade doubled as a pharmaceutical delivery system. As night falls, you imagine wandering past flickering lanterns, the sound of a saw buzzing inside the barber surgeon's shop, and the smell of frankincense drifting from an apothecary's doorway. This town is alive with remedies, some effective, many questionable, but all rooted in the desperate hope to live just a little longer, hurt just a little less. Medicine here isn't sterile or scientific. It's messy, loud, and deeply human. You leave the crowded marketplace with your senses buzzing, the memory of clinking jars, dripping leeches, and the faint shimmer of a so-called unicorn horn rattling in your mind. The medieval town has taught you one thing. Medicine wasn't just about healing. It was also about surviving in a world where trust, belief, and commerce were as potent as any herb or potion. You press on, stepping away from the chatter of the marketplace into a quieter space, a dimly lit chamber that smells of smoke, candle wax, and a sharp tang of dried herbs. Here you've entered the world of the medieval wise woman and folk healer, the ones who lived on the margins of society but were always sought out when official medicine felt too cold, too expensive, or simply too ineffective. Imagine knocking on a creaky wooden door late at night. Inside, an elderly woman with bright, watchful eyes ushers you in. Bundles of lavender and rosemary hang from the rafters, their scents mingling with pungent garlic strung in braids. A blackened cauldron bubbles over a small fire. On the shelves rest jars filled with dried flowers, powdered roots, and, if you dare to look closer, oddities like a frog tied up with twine, or a vial of something that looks suspiciously like animal fat. Mainstream historical fact. Many women, especially in rural communities, were relied upon for herbal knowledge passed down through generations. They delivered babies, tended wounds, and provided everyday remedies for common illnesses. Because formal medical education was closed to them, they operated outside the official system, but their practices formed the backbone of healthcare for much of the population. Quirky tidbit. One popular folk remedy for toothache involved placing a live frog in your mouth and letting it draw out the pain before setting it free. Historians still argue whether people truly believed in such bizarre methods, or whether these examples became exaggerated later by critics eager to dismiss folk healers as ignorant or even dangerous. Joke 1. Imagine explaining to your dentist that you skipped your appointment because you were busy kissing a frog. It's not a fairy tale ending, it's just bad breath. Superstition and ritual often blended seamlessly with genuine botanical knowledge. A wise woman might crush willow bark for pain relief, something we now know contains salicin, the foundation of modern aspirin. But she'd also whisper a charm or trace a protective sign in the air as she administered it. To her patients, the words mattered as much as the plant. Healing wasn't just chemical. It was spiritual, symbolic, and deeply personal. You picture a frightened mother arriving with a feverish child. The wise woman lays a hand on the child's brow, murmurs a prayer to ward off evil spirits, then mixes a syrup of honey, thyme, and vinegar. Whether the fever breaks because of the herbs or because the mother feels reassured doesn't really matter. The point is that both leave believing something was done. In an age without hospitals for the poor, this belief could mean the difference between despair and hope. Of course, superstition had its darker side. Talismans made from dried animal hearts, charms written in blood, and even bits of human bone were said to protect against illness. The line between accepted remedy and feared witchcraft was razor thin. Joke 2. One day you're selling a lucky rabbit's foot, the next day you're accused of dancing with the devil. It's all in the marketing. The church kept a wary eye on these healers, while some clergymen tolerated them, especially when their remedies seemed harmless. Others condemned them outright. The fear of heresy or witchcraft loomed large, and many women with herbal knowledge became scapegoats in times of panic. Historians still debate how much of the witch trial narrative was rooted in genuine suspicion of healers versus broader social anxieties about women wielding power outside male authority. Yet even the most sceptical villagers found themselves drawn back to the wise woman's cottage again and again. She was cheaper than a physician, more accessible than a distant monastery, and often more compassionate than a brusque barber surgeon. She might not cure everything, but she listened, comforted, and tried. Sometimes that mattered more than science. Imagine the atmosphere as she works. Herbs sizzling in hot oil, steam clouding the air, her voice low and steady as she recites words taught to her by her grandmother. You sit nearby, clutching an amulet she gives you, the faint hum of the fire blending with her chanting until you almost believe you can feel the illness lifting. Quirky story. In some regions, people believed carrying a piece of bread with you for 9 days and then feeding it to a dog would transfer your illness into the animal. Practical, not at all, but it shows how creative and symbolic these folk remedies could be. Joke 3. The dog probably didn't appreciate being the medieval garbage disposal for everyone's coughs and fevers. In truth, folk healing was part science, part theatre, and part survival strategy. These women filled the gaps left by institutional medicine, offering care where no one else would. And though their reputation wavered between healer and witch, they preserved a living memory of herbs, rituals, and community trust that helped countless people scrape through the hardships of medieval life. As you leave the wise woman's smoky hut, the scent of herbs clings to your clothes, and the echo of her whispered charms lingers in your ears. Whether you believe in her magic or not, you can't deny she held power. The kind born of knowledge, ritual, and the simple act of being there when no one else was. You wander further down the shadowy path of medieval medicine, and suddenly the sharp scent of herbs and the grim mutter of barber surgeons fade behind you. Instead, your eyes catch a glimmer. Stones, beads, tiny scraps of parchment dangling from cords. You've stepped into the shimmering, sometimes ridiculous but deeply human world of charms and talismans. The medieval belief that objects could bend fate, push away sickness, or lure good health closer to your body like a moth to a flame. Imagine a busy marketplace, mud squelching under your boots, traders shouting their wares, pigs wandering freely between stalls. At one booth, a serious-looking woman holds up a polished sapphire, claiming it will keep plague from your door. Just next to her, a wiry man dangles a wolf's claw strung on leather, promising it'll give you strength and protect you from sudden cramps. At another stall, a priest sells small wooden crosses, each blessed with holy water, each whispered over with a prayer for healing. Everywhere you turn, people clutch, bargain for, or proudly wear their chosen defences against invisible enemies. This wasn't just peasant superstition. Nobles, knights, even kings adored their charms. A wealthy lord might slip a ruby ring onto his finger, convinced it prevented poison. A soldier heading into battle could tuck a relic of a saint inside his armour. A midwife might tie a strip of parchment inscribed with the Lord's Prayer around the wrist of a newborn to keep away fevers. Across social classes, objects became shields, and the line between medicine, magic and religion blurred so much you'd need a scribe's careful hand to tell where one ended and the other began. Mainstream historical fact. Charms and talismans had been around for centuries before the Middle Ages, from the amulets of ancient Egypt to the protective spells of Rome. But medieval Europe gave them its own twist, often layering Christian belief over older pagan customs. A carved cross, a bit of saint's bone, or even soil from a holy site could be packaged as both spiritual relic and medical cure. Quirky tidbit. One of the most peculiar talismans was the abracadabra triangle. People wrote the word abracadabra in a descending triangle on parchment. Full word at the top, then one letter dropped each line until a single A remained. The parchment was folded, strung on a cord and hung around the neck to shrink a fever, just as the letters shrank before your eyes. Historians still argue whether medieval people truly thought the word itself had power, or if it was simply a psychological crutch in a world with few reliable cures. Either way, it makes you want to try it on your next headache. Though imagine explaining that in the office. Joke 1. Sorry boss, I can't finish the report, but don't worry. I'm wearing my abracadabra necklace. Fever's practically gone already. Astrology added another glittering layer. Many physicians refused to act until they consulted the heavens. Was the moon in the right phase? Was Saturn sitting moodily in the wrong house? Your surgery, your purgative, even your haircut might be delayed until the stars gave their approval. If your barber surgeon said he couldn't lance your abscess until Tuesday because Venus was out of alignment, you didn't argue. Well, you could, but then you'd still have the abscess. Joke 2. Suddenly waiting 3 months for a dentist appointment doesn't seem so bad, right? As you pass through the crowd, you see charms for every imaginable ailment. Coral beads are supposed to cool fevers. Amber protects against toothaches. Jet, a fossilized wood, defends you from stomach troubles. Some mothers stitch little pouches with bits of wolf skin inside, believing it wards off nightmares. Others place a mole's foot in a baby's crib to prevent cramps. Yes, you heard that right. A mole's foot. You can almost hear medieval parents saying, "Don't worry, sweetie, no cramps tonight, Mommy bought you a paw." Joke 3. Talk about a bedtime gift that screams romance. "Here, darling, I got you a mole's foot." The church's relationship with charms was complicated. Officially, anything that smacked of superstition was frowned upon. But relics, bones of saints, splinters of the true cross, drops of sacred oil, were openly venerated and sold as protective healing tokens. Pilgrims travelled weeks, even months, just to touch or kiss these relics, convinced they held divine power. Historians still debate whether most common folk distinguished much between relics and forbidden charms. After all, if touching a saint's jawbone cured your fever, did it really matter whether the church approved? You lean closer and watch a mother fastening a tiny amulet pouch around her child's neck. The boy squirms, but she pats his cheek and whispers a prayer. Nearby, a knight adjusts his armour, making sure his relic is secure against his chest before riding into the unknown. A farmer buries a talisman in the corner of his field to protect his livestock from sudden sickness. In each case, the object becomes more than wood, stone, or parchment. It becomes reassurance, a little island of control in a sea of uncertainty. Psychologists today might call it placebo. But in a world where disease was invisible and explanations were scarce, that placebo might be the strongest medicine available. Believing you were protected sometimes gave you strength to endure. Believing your child's charm kept them safe helped you sleep through the night. The mind and the object worked together, weaving faith into physical form. And here's the twist. You still do this. Maybe you carry a lucky coin, wear a necklace your grandmother gave you, or keep a rabbit's foot on your keychain. People buy crystals, bracelets, or wellness pendants today with promises that sound suspiciously medieval. The urge to hold on to something tangible, something that claims to guard your health, hasn't really left us. The packaging may look more modern, the words more scientific, but the longing is the same. As the marketplace hum fades in your ears, you realise something. Medieval talismans weren't only about superstition, they were about comfort. They were about the deep, aching human need to believe you had some say in your own survival, even if all you could do was hang a scrap of parchment around your neck and whisper abracadabra. The deeper you go into the medicine of the Middle Ages, the stranger the cures become. Picture yourself lying in a creaky wooden bed, your throat sore and swollen, candles flickering on the rough stone walls. You expect the healer to bring herbs, maybe a bitter potion, or at least a soothing poultice. Instead, she walks in carrying a chicken. A live, flapping, indignant chicken, its feathers rustling, its head twitching nervously. She sets it gently against your neck, ties its wings to hold it in place, and explains with utter seriousness that the bird will draw your sickness out of you, soaking it up like a sponge. This was the world of transference cures, and for many medieval people it was considered perfectly reasonable medicine. The basic idea was simple. Sickness was something that could be moved. If illness could leave your body and take up residence in something else, then you were free. The problem wasn't so much curing the disease as redirecting it into another host. That host could be an animal, an object, or even the earth itself. Chickens were popular for throat infections, but sheep, goats, and pigs sometimes played the role as well. There are reports of sheep pressed against feverish children, or goats tethered to patients with the hope that the animal would weaken while the human recovered. Sometimes, people even believed that if the animal died, it had proven the cure had worked. The disease had transferred successfully. One recorded cure from England advised rubbing a piece of bacon fat on a skin boil, then feeding that same bacon to a dog. Once the dog ate it, the boil would supposedly vanish. For warts, the cure could be even simpler. Take a raw potato, rub it over the wart, then bury the potato in the ground. As the potato rotted away, the wart was believed to shrivel too. These rituals combined medicine with symbolism, making sickness feel like something you could literally pass along, bury, or discard. Here's a quirky tidbit. In some European villages, epilepsy was thought to be contagious by clothing. If a person had a seizure, their garments could be stripped off and placed onto a donkey. The donkey, then driven out of town, became the unfortunate carrier of the disorder. Imagine being that poor animal suddenly blamed for someone's nervous system problems. It's the ultimate wrong place, wrong time. The domestic scenes must have been extraordinary to witness. Families huddling around, whispering prayers as bacon was rubbed on rashes, or potatoes solemnly lowered into gardens as if performing a burial service. Chickens squawking indignantly while healers explained, "No, this will help. Trust me." Joke 1. If you were the chicken, you'd probably be thinking, "Excuse me, I signed up for free grain, not throat duty." Transfer cures didn't always require livestock. Sometimes coins, bits of wood, or small stones were rubbed against warts or swellings, then hidden away or tossed into rivers. The idea was always the same. The object absorbed your illness, but you had to get rid of it quickly. If someone stumbled upon the discarded item, there was a risk they might catch your sickness. Imagine having to apologize. "Sorry, I think you found my old potato. If you grow a wart next week, that's on me." Joke 2. It's basically the medieval version of sending the wrong text. You didn't mean to pass your problem along, but somebody else got it anyway. Some transfer cures were even weighed. Folk healers occasionally placed meat, bread, or cloth against a sick person, then weighed it before and after. If it seemed heavier, they claimed it had absorbed the illness. The bread or meat was then burned, buried, or thrown away. This blending of ritual with measurement shows how creative medieval healers could be. In a world without microscopes, bacteria, or viruses, the imagination stepped in to make sense of invisible forces. Another example comes from toothaches. Patients sometimes pressed an iron nail to their aching gums, then hammered that nail into the ground. The earth, it was believed, would pull the pain out and lock it away. Archaeologists have indeed discovered clusters of buried nails near medieval settlements, thought to be remnants of such cures. Picture a medieval farmer grimacing in pain, muttering, "Take this ache, O earth," before pounding the nail into his yard. Joke 3. The neighbours must have wondered why he kept fixing nails into the dirt instead of his roof. From our modern perspective, it's tempting to laugh, but transfer cures reflected a very human impulse. Illness felt mysterious, terrifying, and unpredictable. By creating rituals of transference, people believed they were giving sickness a direction, forcing it to leave. In a way, it's not so different from how we talk today. You might say, "I need to shake this cold off," or "I just want to get this bug out of my system." We still imagine illness as something that can be pushed away, even if we now use medicine instead of poultry. There's also a psychological power in these rituals. Rubbing a potato on your skin, then burying it, gives you the tangible sense of removing your illness. The brain can interpret that action as real healing, sometimes even producing measurable effects. Modern science would call it placebo, but placebo isn't fake. It's the very real influence of belief on the body. If a medieval patient felt relief after tying a chicken to their throat, it didn't matter whether the chicken actually absorbed germs. What mattered was the sense of hope. So as you picture these strange cures, the bacon on boils, the buried potatoes, the nails hammered into soil, you realize how resourceful people were in their desperation. They didn't have antibiotics, antiseptics, or vaccines. What they did have was ritual, imagination, and the unshakable belief that sickness could be bargained with, redirected, and expelled. And maybe that belief, in its own strange way, was as healing as any herb or potion. You wake to the sound of bells outside a monastery. the dawn air sharp with incense and damp stone. But this isn't a peaceful prayer service. It's a hospital ward, the kind that monks ran across medieval Europe. And here, instead of surgical knives gleaming in a sterile room, you see shelves stacked with dried herbs, jars of strange powders, and racks of wooden crosses. Tonight you find yourself exploring the world of saints' relics, charms and holy healing, the sacred side of medieval medicine, where faith was just as important as poultices and potions. Healing in this era wasn't only about plants or procedures. Often it meant turning toward God, the Virgin Mary, or the saints. People believed that sickness could be punishment for sin, a test of faith, or even the work of demons. And so, the cure wasn't always in the body, it was in the soul. Monasteries preserved not just books but also relics, bones of saints, splinters said to be from the true cross, and vials of holy water. Patients were brought before these objects, touched by them, or made to drink water that had been washed over them. It might sound wild now, but for a feverish peasant, being close to the arm bone of a saint was as reassuring as lying in a modern hospital bed. One mainstream fact: across Europe, shrines dedicated to saints were considered healing destinations. Pilgrims hobbled or crawled for miles, believing the journey itself could bring health. Canterbury Cathedral in England, with the shrine of Thomas Becket, became one of the most famous destinations. People claimed miraculous recoveries after praying at his tomb. Some even left crutches or bandages behind as proof of their cure. These tokens piled up like medieval medical testimonials, the Instagram before and after posts of their day. A quirky detail: certain relics weren't just kept in churches, they were worn as amulets. Bits of fabric supposedly touched to holy bodies were sewn into necklaces or carried in pouches. One rather odd example: a charm made from the milk of the Virgin Mary, which was really just powdered white stone. Pilgrims would buy it, dissolve it in wine, and drink it for protection. Joke 1. Nothing like a sip of chalky holy milk to really round out your dinner. Charms and prayers were also tailored to very specific ailments. For headaches, people sometimes tied written prayers tightly around their foreheads. For childbirth pains, midwives whispered invocations to saints known for protection. Even the dreaded plague drove people to holy remedies. St. Roch, for example, was often invoked because he was believed to have survived plague himself. His image spread across Europe as a talisman of safety, painted on walls and carved into small wooden figures. Historians still argue whether the Church encouraged these practices as genuine cures or tolerated them mainly to provide comfort. After all, some monks were highly skilled in herbalism and surgery, writing detailed medical texts that blended faith with observation. But for the common person, relics and prayers felt more accessible than a Latin-educated physician. If you couldn't afford a doctor, you could at least rub your aching leg against a shrine railing and hope the saint inside was listening. One particularly fascinating relic cure involved holy wells. Across Britain and Ireland, sacred springs were visited by those with skin conditions, eye troubles, or joint pain. Pilgrims bathed, drank, or even rolled in the mud near these wells. The connection to water, purity, and renewal was powerful. Modern scientists have tested some of these sites and found that a few actually did contain minerals with antibacterial properties. Joke 2. So yes, medieval people might have been the first to invent the spa day, minus the cucumber slices over the eyes. Of course, not everyone believed the relics themselves had power. Some insisted it was faith alone that healed. The relic was only a physical reminder. Others accused the Church of fraud, especially when shady dealers sold fake bones of saints or splinters of the true cross. There were supposedly so many pieces of the cross floating around Europe that one scholar joked you could build an entire ship out of them. Still, whether fake or not, the relics provided real psychological comfort. Sometimes relic cures blended with folk rituals. A woman might press a charm against her child's fevered head, then recite a Latin prayer while also whispering a local rhyme passed down from her grandmother. Healing was rarely just one thing. It was layered, a mix of sacred and superstitious. Joke 3. Basically, if your kid was sick, you covered all bases. Doctor's advice, saint's charm, grandma's potato trick. Because hey, better safe than sorry. What's striking about these relic cures is how they brought communities together. Pilgrimages were social events. Healing ceremonies in churches gathered crowds who shared in the hope, the chanting, and the atmosphere of miracle. For the sick, even if the relic didn't cure them physically, it often lifted their spirit, which in turn could ease symptoms. Modern psychology might call it community-based therapy. In the Middle Ages, it was a miracle. As you leave the monastery ward in your imagination, the smell of incense still lingering, you realize how intertwined medicine and faith truly were. To medieval minds, healing wasn't just a science. It was a sacred negotiation between body, soul, and the invisible powers that governed the universe. You drift now into a darker chamber, where the flicker of torchlight makes shadows dance across walls marked with chalk sigils. The smell of crushed herbs mixes with something less pleasant, animal fat maybe, or singed hair. You've stepped into the world of folk healers, wise women, and magical cures, a realm where medicine, magic, and superstition overlap so tightly that you can't always tell where one ends and the other begins. For much of the Middle Ages, rural communities had little or no access to trained physicians. University doctors were expensive, urban-based, and usually spoke Latin, not exactly useful for a peasant farmer with a cow falling ill or a baby struggling to breathe. Instead, villages turned to their own healers, figures often called cunning folk, wise women, or herbalists. These people weren't always officially trained, but they knew the land, the plants, and the stories passed down through generations. You picture someone leaning over a wooden table, grinding herbs in a mortar, whispering prayers or spells, while the smoke from a small fire curls toward the rafters. Mainstream fact: many folk healers genuinely knew effective herbal remedies. For example, willow bark, used for pain relief, contains salicin, the same chemical family as modern aspirin. Garlic was used to treat infections. Honey was applied to wounds because of its antibacterial qualities. Some of these remedies really worked, though at the time people thought of them not as science, but as gifts from God or the hidden powers of nature. But alongside the practical remedies came the strange ones. Quirky detail. Some healers recommended carrying a dried toad in a small pouch around your neck to prevent seizures. Others suggested cutting your fingernails on a Friday and burying the clippings under the threshold of your house to keep evil spirits out. Joke 1. Forget home security systems. Just sprinkle your nail clippings around, and burglars or demons will think twice. Charms and spoken spells were common. A wise woman might murmur a half-Christian, half-pagan incantation over a feverish child, calling on saints' names while drawing protective circles. Sometimes the healer instructed the family to repeat certain words 9 times while turning counterclockwise, because odd numbers were thought to hold mystical strength. Historians still argue whether these practices were purely symbolic, or whether the repetition and ritual gave psychological comfort that genuinely improved outcomes. In some cases, magical cures took on a theatrical air. For toothaches, one could chant a rhyme while poking an iron nail into the bark of an oak tree, transferring the pain into the wood. For warts, rubbing them with raw meat and then burying the meat was supposed to pass the affliction to the earth. Joke 2. Somewhere out there is a medieval pig thinking, great, now I've got acne thanks to your weird ritual. Folk healers also often doubled as midwives, guiding women through childbirth. Here, their knowledge of herbs like pennyroyal or sage, some useful, some dangerous, played a huge role. But childbirth was also laced with magic. Amulets hung around the mother's neck. Prayers whispered in rhythm with contractions. Even charms drawn on the floor to ward off evil spirits, thought to prey on women in labour. For communities with no doctors nearby, these midwives were trusted, even revered, yet their power was double-edged. A healer who succeeded might be praised as a blessing. One who failed, especially if the illness worsened, could be accused of witchcraft. Scholars still debate how much medieval medicine blurred into witch-hunting hysteria. Some argue that most wise women were tolerated as long as they helped, while others point to darker times when the line between healer and sorcerer was perilously thin. Animals often entered the mix too. Folk cures recommended wearing the heart of a hare around your neck for courage, or smearing the fat of a black cat on wounds. Chickens were sometimes placed on plague sores, as if the disease could be drawn out into the bird. There's a strange, almost ritualistic sense of substitution here. The idea that pain or illness could be passed along to another being or object. Joke 3. So yes, medieval medicine sometimes looked like a very unfun episode of Animal Planet. One fascinating element was astrology. Folk healers often consulted the stars before prescribing remedies, believing that certain times were better for bloodletting, planting healing herbs, or brewing potions. If the moon was in the wrong phase, a cure might fail. This connection between sky and sickness may sound mystical, but it shows how deeply medieval people tried to weave the entire universe into their understanding of health. Despite the oddities, these folk healers filled a gap. In many ways, they were the bridge between communal tradition and emerging medical knowledge. They carried fragments of ancient herbal lore, fragments of Christian prayer, and fragments of older pagan magic, all bundled together in cures that, strangely enough, sometimes worked. And even when they didn't, they gave comfort, which is its own kind of medicine. As you step back from the smoky room, the whisper of charms still echoing in your ears, you realize just how blurred the line was between healing and magic. To medieval people, there was no clear border. Healing meant using every possible tool, nature, prayer, ritual, or superstition, to push back against pain in a world that felt fragile and uncertain. You wander now into a dimly lit monastic library, where the faint glow of beeswax candles makes the gold leaf on manuscript pages shimmer. Shelves creak under the weight of thick tomes bound in leather, some copied by hand over years of painstaking effort. At first glance, it feels safe and studious, like the quiet corner of a university library. But remember, this is the Middle Ages. Here, medicine is not only about plants, poultices, or even surgery. It is wrapped tightly in faith, ritual, and sometimes outright magical thinking. You're about to see how monasteries blended prayer with practice, relics with remedies, and hope with holy dust. Monks were some of the most educated men of their age. Literacy was rare, but monasteries preserved and copied ancient texts, particularly those of Hippocrates and Galen, classical authors whose ideas on humours and bodily balance influenced medicine for centuries. They also studied De Materia Medica by Dioscorides, which described hundreds of plants and their uses. Mainstream fact. One of the most famous medieval works, Physica, by Hildegard of Bingen, a German abbess and visionary, combined detailed herbal knowledge with what she claimed were divine revelations. So already you see how blurred the line between empirical observation and spiritual guidance could be. But knowledge didn't stop at books. Monasteries often kept extensive herb gardens, carefully labelled and cultivated, where lavender, sage, fennel and rosemary thrived. These weren't grown just to season the soup, they were tools of healing. Lavender was believed to calm headaches, sage to ward off fevers, fennel to aid digestion. It feels almost modern, until you remember that treatments were almost always paired with prayers, blessings or relics. Joke 1. Think of it as Whole Foods mixed with a cathedral gift shop. Relics played an enormous role in healing. If you were ill, you might be advised not only to drink an herbal tonic, but also to kneel before a saint's bone, a scrap of cloth, or a vial of what was claimed to be holy blood. Pilgrims travelled miles, sometimes risking their lives just to touch these objects. Imagine limping hundreds of miles with arthritis, only to rub your aching knee on a saint's shin bone. That, my friend, was medieval health insurance. And there were stranger cures. Quirky fact, some monasteries kept dust scraped from the tombs of saints, and patients were told to swallow it mixed with wine or water. Others offered water that had been poured over relics, believing the liquid absorbed divine power. There are even stories of people encouraged to eat the wax from altar candles, thinking the holiness of the object would drive illness away. Joke 2. So yes, next time you accidentally chew your birthday candle, just remember, you're basically following a medieval health plan. Holy water was also sprinkled on wounds, crosses laid upon the sick, and prayers whispered at dawn and dusk. Certain Bible passages were considered especially powerful, like verses from the Book of Tobit, which describes using fish gall for healing. Monks might chant psalms over a feverish patient, believing the vibration of sacred words carried curative force. Historians still argue whether this should be seen as spiritual placebo, magical ritual, or simply the only available form of comfort in a frightening world. Charms and amulets added another layer. Written slips of parchment inscribed with verses or holy symbols were tied around the neck or worn under clothing. Some contained the names of the three magi, others short passages from the Psalms. These amulets blurred categories we separate today. Were they medicine, religion, or magic? Medieval people didn't care. They just wanted relief. Patients weren't only peasants. Nobles sent sick family members to monasteries, confident that monks would both pray for their souls and attempt some kind of cure. Treatments included herbal brews, poultices, bloodletting, or fasting. If nothing worked, at least the patient was surrounded by prayer and holy rituals, which people believed gave them a better chance in the afterlife. Practical comfort and spiritual insurance rolled into one package deal. One odd relic story stands out. In a German monastery, a small flask was displayed that supposedly contained the very breath of Jesus. Pilgrims would gaze upon it with awe, certain it carried miraculous power. Historians today can't decide whether people really believed such things, or whether they went along because the social and spiritual rewards of pilgrimage outweighed skepticism. Either way, the devotion was real, and for many so was the hope of healing. There were also pilgrimages prescribed almost like a doctor's note. Feeling unwell? Travel to the shrine of St. Thomas Becket in Canterbury, or St. Cuthbert in Durham, and perhaps your ailments will fade. The journey itself, with its long walks, fresh air, and sense of purpose, may have had real therapeutic benefits. Modern science would call that exercise and stress relief. Medieval people called it divine intervention. Joke 3. Basically, it was the medieval version of your doctor telling you to get your steps in, but with a side of saintly blessings. It's important to remember that monks themselves weren't blind to practical effects. Many truly observed how herbs helped certain symptoms, or how rest and fasting could improve conditions. But their worldview didn't separate natural and supernatural. Both were seen as gifts from God, both tools for healing. To them, science and faith weren't opposites but partners. Still, debates existed. Some monks emphasized herbs and observation. Others insisted only prayer and relics mattered. Historians still argue whether these monastic practices slowed the development of rational medicine or preserved vital knowledge that would otherwise have been lost. Without monasteries, many classical texts might not have survived at all. Imagine yourself in that candlelit room, the smell of parchment, ink, and herbs mingling with incense. A monk leans over you, murmuring a psalm as he ties a parchment charm around your neck. You sip a bitter brew of sage and honey, while relics glint faintly in the background. To you, lying feverish in the 12th century, this is not superstition. It's the best of both worlds. Body and soul treated together. Relics, charms, chants, and holy dust might sound absurd to us, but they provided hope, and in many cases hope itself is a kind of medicine. Maybe the real power was in giving patients the strength to endure. You step back from the shelves now, closing the heavy wooden door, but the chant of monks lingers in your ears, and the faint herbal smoke clings to your clothes. Healing, you realize, was never just about herbs or bones or relics. It was about reminding people they weren't alone in their suffering, that their pain was shared with God, saints, and the whole praying community. The library door swings shut behind you, and now your steps echo into another part of the monastery, the infirmary. The smell hits first. Herbs drying in bundles overhead, vinegar in clay jugs, the faint musk of wool blankets. Wooden beds are lined up along the walls, each holding a patient swaddled in rough linen sheets. Some groan with fever, others lie quiet with swollen joints or bandaged wounds. In the corner, a monk mixes something in a mortar, the rhythmic scrape of pestle against stone filling the air. Here, healing looks at once familiar and strange. The infirmary was a place where theory met practice. Unlike the hushed library, this was the arena of action, where monks tried to apply what they'd read in manuscripts and observed in nature. To many, monasteries were not just centres of faith, but the closest thing Europe had to hospitals. They offered food, shelter, and some kind of medical care, luxuries most peasants could never access in their own homes. One detail stands out. Monasteries often followed the ancient concept of the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Health meant keeping these fluids in balance. Illness meant imbalance. The treatment? Adjust diet, purge, bleed, or prescribe herbs. Example: a fever was thought to be caused by too much blood, so bleeding or leeching might be ordered. Weak digestion, too much phlegm. Prescribe fennel or mint. Sounds bizarre to us, but it was a structured system, one that gave monks a framework to act upon. Bloodletting was especially common. Leeches were collected from rivers and stored in jars, ready to attach to unlucky patients. If you imagine rows of monks gently applying leeches while chanting psalms, you're not far off. Some even believed the leeches themselves carried divine symbolism, tiny creatures sent by God to suck out sin along with sickness. Joke 1. Today, we call it detox tea. Back then, they called it a jar of leeches. Diet was another cornerstone. Monks prescribed food according to humoral theory, carefully matching hot or cold foods to restore balance. For example, if a patient had chills, they might be given warm spiced wine. If they suffered from too much heat, cucumbers or lettuce were recommended. These rules influenced not only medicine but monastic kitchens themselves. Meals were planned with the idea of keeping the whole community healthy, not just filling bellies. Interestingly, monasteries also pioneered some practices that resemble modern nursing. Patients were washed, fed, and kept under observation. Records show monks even kept patient notes, rudimentary case histories. In some monasteries, the infirmary was staffed around the clock with novices taking turns tending fires, fetching water, or reading prayers at the bedside. This blend of caregiving, observation and ritual was centuries ahead of its time. Then there were the poultices. Herbs were crushed, mixed with animal fats or honey, and applied directly to wounds. Honey in particular was valued not just for sweetness, but for its preservative qualities. It slowed infection. Garlic, onions and vinegar also made frequent appearances. Some of these remedies had real antimicrobial effects, though monks didn't know why. Quirky fact. Garlic and wine-soaked cloths were sometimes stuffed into wounds, a practice that may have saved lives by fighting bacteria, even if the monks thought of it in spiritual rather than scientific terms. Of course, not all treatments sound so convincing. Some recipes called for powdered unicorn horn, which was actually narwhal tusk sold by traders at outrageous prices, or the liver of a black cat as a cure for tuberculosis. These weren't common in monasteries, but sometimes slipped into the pharmacopoeia when desperate patients demanded miraculous solutions. Joke 2. So if someone offered you a unicorn horn for your cough, congratulations, you were the medieval equivalent of buying overpriced essential oils on Instagram. The infirmary was also a spiritual theatre. Healing wasn't just physical, but eternal. Before undergoing a risky treatment, like cauterization with hot iron or a deep incision, a patient might be given confession and last rites in case they didn't survive. Imagine lying in bed, smelling burning metal, hearing a monk softly remind you to make peace with God just before he presses the iron to your abscess. Terrifying, yes, but to the medieval mind, body and soul couldn't be separated. One touching detail: many monasteries reserved a special corner for the dying. There, monks would surround the patient chanting prayers, holding relics, and easing their passing. To modern ears, it sounds grim. To medieval families, it was reassurance that their loved one wouldn't die alone. Comfort was as important as cure. Sometimes, monasteries became overwhelmed. During plagues, infirmaries overflowed. Records tell of monks nursing dozens at once, sometimes until they themselves succumbed. During the Black Death, entire communities of monks and nuns were wiped out while tending the sick. Their sacrifice is one of the reasons we can think of them as early precursors to hospital staff. Joke 3. You could say monks invented hazard pay, except their pay was eternal salvation, not coins. There's also evidence monasteries practiced forms of quarantine. Patients with contagious illnesses were sometimes placed in separate outbuildings or isolated wings. This wasn't perfect. Without germ theory, monks thought disease spread through miasmas or bad air, but keeping the sick apart from the healthy sometimes slowed outbreaks. And yet, hope mattered as much as herbs. A patient might sip fennel tea in the morning, undergo bleeding at noon, and then be led to touch a relic in the chapel by evening. Each step wove body, soul and community together in a single pattern. Healing was holistic long before the word existed. Picture it clearly now. The dim infirmary, monks in habits moving between beds, leeches wriggling in jars, poultices steaming with herbs, prayers floating in the air like incense. You might scoff at some of their methods, but if you lived in the 11th century, this was the best care available, and in some ways more compassionate than treatments found in royal courts. For the poor and weary, monasteries were lifelines. When you leave the infirmary, the sound of chanting follows you out into the cold corridor. You realise that in this age, medicine wasn't just about curing symptoms. It was about preserving dignity, easing fear, and tying earthly suffering to the promise of eternal life. To medieval patients, that was healing in its truest sense. The corridor winds deeper into the monastery, and you arrive at a place both practical and surprisingly modern, the apothecary. The room is dim but busy, lined with shelves stacked high with clay jars, glass vials, and cloth sacks tied with twine. Each container bears a handwritten label, sometimes in Latin, sometimes in the local tongue, naming the treasures inside: dried sage leaves, powdered willow bark, rose oil, vinegar, and exotic spices traded from faraway lands. The smell here is overwhelming, a heady mix of earth, sweetness, bitterness, and sharp tangs of resin. It is part kitchen, part laboratory, part sacred space. Unlike the infirmary, which served patients directly, the apothecary was the preparation hub. Here, monks transformed raw plants into usable medicines: teas, syrups, tinctures, ointments, and powders. Pestles pounded ceaselessly against mortars, while bubbling cauldrons infused herbs into oils. The apothecary was the closest thing the Middle Ages had to a pharmacy, and monasteries took pride in their stock. Some even cultivated their own herb gardens, carefully planned with medicinal plants grouped according to function: digestives, pain relievers, fever reducers, and antiseptics. What makes this place fascinating is how it combined science, faith, and experiment. Recipes came from multiple sources: classical medical texts by Hippocrates and Galen, medieval manuals copied in the scriptorium, and even local folk remedies shared by peasants. For example, willow bark was recommended for pain. Centuries later, we know it contains salicin, a precursor to aspirin. Monks might not have known the chemistry, but through observation they learned what worked. Trial and error was quietly shaping a proto-scientific tradition. Of course, the process wasn't all rational. Many recipes included prayers or blessings as essential ingredients. A healing salve might call for not only ground comfrey root and honey, but also 3 recitations of the Lord's Prayer while stirring clockwise. Faith and function were inseparable. Monks believed divine blessing activated the remedy, turning ordinary plants into conduits of God's grace. Joke 1. Forget FDA approval. In the monastery, the only stamp of approval was the sign of the cross. Monastic apothecaries were surprisingly connected to global trade. Spices from the East, pepper, cinnamon, ginger, filtered into Europe through merchants, and monasteries valued them both for flavour and medicine. Ginger was prescribed for nausea, cinnamon for colds, and black pepper for circulation. The apothecary's shelves were like time capsules of medieval globalization. To a patient, being offered a syrup flavoured with ginger might feel like tasting another world. Alcohol played a key role too. Monks brewed not only beer and wine for sustenance, but also used alcohol as a solvent for medicines. Tinctures, herbs steeped in alcohol, were preserved longer and absorbed more effectively. That meant monasteries weren't just pharmacies, but also early pharmaceutical manufacturers. A jar of rosemary-infused wine might soothe headaches, while wormwood steeped in spirits was given for stomach worms. Joke 2. So if you ever took a shot of monk-made wormwood tincture, you could say you were partying and deworming at the same time. The apothecary also reflects the medieval worldview of harmony. Plants were thought to carry cosmic properties, aligned with planets, seasons, and humours. For instance, fennel was hot and dry, and thus balanced cold, wet illnesses. Mint was linked with Mars, lending it fiery strength. It sounds mystical, but it gave monks a structured way to catalogue and apply remedies. Catalogues, or herbals, were often illustrated with careful drawings, making these books not just medical texts but works of art. Preparation itself could be elaborate. Consider a cough syrup, honey boiled gently, mixed with thyme and sage, strained through linen and stored in a stoppered bottle. Or a wound ointment, lard melted over fire, mixed with crushed garlic, marigold petals and wine, then cooled into a paste. Each batch required patience, attention, and sometimes weeks of waiting for proper fermentation or infusion. In this way, monks practiced something akin to chemistry centuries before the field had a name. Yet mistakes happened. Herbs could be misidentified, contaminated, or overdosed. Hemlock and foxglove grew alongside safe plants and could cause serious poisoning. Some monks recorded cases where a patient grew worse after treatment. Unlike modern pharmacists, medieval monks lacked standardized dosages, relying instead on vague instructions like a handful or until it seems enough. Joke 3. Imagine getting your medicine labelled take 1 sip or maybe 2 unless you die first. Then it was too much. The apothecary was also a teaching ground. Novices learned here by grinding herbs, measuring powders, and copying recipes. Knowledge passed from master to student, preserved in handwritten manuals that sometimes became widely copied herbals. In a world with little formal education outside church walls, monasteries quietly nurtured medical literacy. Interestingly, some monasteries supplied remedies to the surrounding community. Villagers might come knocking, not for confession, but for a jar of ointment or a pinch of dried herb. This made monasteries hubs of both spiritual and physical healing, bridging the gap between elite knowledge and everyday survival. It also cemented the monks' role as trusted authorities, blending medicine with ministry. During epidemics, however, even the best-stocked apothecaries faltered. No amount of sage tea or vinegar syrup could stop the Black Death. Records suggest monks turned to desperate measures, fumigating rooms with burning herbs, drinking concoctions of crushed pearls, or even crafting charms inscribed with holy verses. These actions might not have worked medically, but they gave people a sense of agency, a way to fight the invisible. Hope, after all, is its own medicine. Standing in the apothecary, jars glowing faintly in the candlelight, you can imagine the monks' hands dusty with herbs, their chants murmuring as they stir bubbling pots. This was the alchemy of the Middle Ages, not turning lead into gold, but turning nature into healing. Even if some remedies seem odd, others, like honey for wounds or willow bark for pain, foreshadowed modern medicine. The apothecary, in its mix of trial, error, prayer and persistence, was a small laboratory of survival. As you leave the room, the scents linger on your clothes, mint sharp, rosemary woody, honey sweet. You realise that while monks framed their work in faith, their daily grind in the apothecary laid the foundation for pharmacy and medicine as we know them today. What looks primitive was, in truth, the careful weaving of knowledge that bridged ancient wisdom with the future. As you let the last images fade, Notice how your mind drifts between curiosity and calm. You've wandered through shadowy streets filled with herbs, bones, leeches, and whispered prayers, and now those strange medicines slowly dissolve like mist. The clatter of barber surgeons, the scent of rosemary smoke, the soft glow of candles in crowded infirmaries, they are all behind you, tucked safely in the past. What lingers is not the unease, but the quiet fascination with how people once faced fear and fragility. The more you reflect, the more gentle everything becomes. The shrieking mandrake no longer cries. The plague doctor's mask no longer looms. It is only memory, softened by time. You recognize that even in the most unsettling cures, there was a simple thread of hope, a desire to heal, to comfort, to carry on. That hope is universal, stretching from those medieval healers all the way to you, resting here tonight. So breathe slowly, allowing the story to settle. Imagine the air itself smoothing your thoughts, as though each exhale carries away a fragment of the old world. The people you've met return to silence, their remedies folded back into dusty manuscripts and forgotten apothecary jars. Only the calm remains, like the hush after a long day's wandering. Let your eyelids grow heavy, your body sink deeper into rest. You are safe, you are warm, and the odd medicines of the past can trouble you no longer. They belong to history, while you belong to this peaceful moment. Drift gently now, carried on the quiet tide of sleep where no leeches bite, no stars dictate fate, and no strange powders cloud the air, only stillness, only dreams.